"Dad, buy me these sneakers," Helen exclaimed, looking her father in the eyes. Anthony tore himself away from his phone and glanced at the sneakers, which, in his opinion, were simply dreadful. They had a heavy sole, black with some metallic studs on the sides. "Are you going for a gothic look?" he asked. "What is this nightmare?" "No, they're cool," Helen retorted. "Mandy has the same ones. She says these sneakers are very comfortable and cool." "Cool," Anthony repeated mockingly. "Your Mandy herself looks like she's from a horror movie and she paints her lips black. Let her dress however she wants. That's not my problem. But I'm not letting you go home in those shoes, just so you know." "Boring," said Helen. "Why don't you check out those shoes on the top shelf?" the man suggested. "Seems like there's something normal and girly there." "Yeah, all pink and sparkly, like for 5-year-olds, Helen muttered. "Or like Nancy. Normal people don't wear that." "It's not Nancy. It's Miss Nancy," her father corrected her. Helen couldn't stand their neighbor Nancy, and Anthony shared some of her feelings. Taking advantage of the fact that his daughter had disappeared among the shelves, the man buried himself in his phone again. The football match was in full swing. One could only hope that Helen wouldn't bother him until the next goal. Anthony's hopes were not fulfilled. The girl returned at the most crucial moment when the opposing team was about to take a free kick. Helen tugged at her father's sleeve. "If I can have the sneakers, then let's at least buy a dress," she demanded. "Buy it. Just leave me alone," Anthony said, holding his phone close to his nose. "How can I buy it?" "Give me money," Helen replied. Without looking, Anthony handed her his wallet, and the girl ran towards the cash register. The team he was cheering for conceded a goal. Anthony gritted his teeth nervously. If the day started badly, it would continue that way until the evening. Next to Anthony, someone coughed hesitantly. He expected to see Helen with some nonsense again and said discontentedly, "Well, what else do you want?" Anthony tore his gaze away from his phone and looked bewildered. A girl in a uniform stood next to him, apparently an employee of the store. The saleswoman was young and attractive but had a stunned expression on her face, as if Anthony had just barked at her. "Excuse me," the man said. "Forgive me. I thought you were my daughter." The girl nodded. "It's okay, I understand. It's because of your daughter that I approached you. Did you give her a credit card?" "I did." "What's the matter? Is there not enough funds on it?" No, nothing like that," reassured the girl, "or rather, I don't know yet. I just wanted to confirm, are you really willing to buy all this?" "What is this?" Anthony didn't understand and looked towards the cash register. His daughter stood there, looking at him as if he had offended her. Some rags lay in front of the cash register. Anthony approached and examined them. A dark skirt that seemed strict but extremely short. Some top with straps. A dress with a voluminous hem, as if for a ball. "What is this?" Anthony repeated, addressing his daughter. "My shopping," she replied. "You said I could buy anything I wanted." "Firstly, I don't recall saying that," the man replied. "And secondly, why do you need all this junk? You can't wear such clothes to school. We weren't invited to a masquerade, were we?" "For the joy of a soul," Helen replied, rolling her eyes. "That's what Nancy's mom says when she sits down to watch silly TV shows." "It's Miss Nancy," Anthony corrected, took the wallet from his daughter's hands, and headed towards the exit. "Thank you, ladies, for the time you spent on us." The salespeople nodded and smiled at him. Passing by the girl who had annoyed Anthony, Helen muttered, "Tattletale." The saleswoman smiled at Anthony. "You wouldn't bother yourself so much and wouldn't go shopping with your daughter," she advised. "After all, it's not a man's business." "But I can't just let her go alone," Anthony replied. "Someone has to go with her." "What about your wife?" "Let her look after the girl. It'll be more fun for both of them." "Idiot," Helen whispered. Anthony didn't waste time on apologies. He immediately pulled her out of the store. "How do you speak to adults?" the man nervously asked. "When was the last time I disciplined you? And who is she if not a tattletale?" Helen asked. Why did she come up to you? Who asked her to complain? I didn't do anything wrong. I was just going to pay for the clothes. I'm a free person. I have the right to buy whatever I want. Let me think, Anthony muttered. Maybe this girl approached me because my name was on the card. She just wanted to make sure that I really wanted to buy all this clothing, or not. And she was absolutely right, because I don't want to buy it. It's a disgrace. It would be embarrassing to be seen in such clothes. The girl got offended. Dad, you're just cheapskate. Just admit it. But what you were about to buy was indeed absurd. Just like Nancy wears, Anthony said. Saying these words, he mentally apologized to the neighbor. He really needed to smooth things over with his daughter, so he had to resort to extreme measures. It worked. Helen smiled. Miss Nancy, she said, maybe we can go somewhere and grab a bite. Honestly, I got really hungry waiting for you to try on everything, he suggested. I'm in, nodded the girl. But where are we going? A hint of caution appeared on her face, as if she was afraid her father would take her to some fancy restaurant. Anthony was surprised. Did he really look like a pompous adult? A mere money bag even in his daughter's eyes. Though, truth be told, he didn't have that much money. The small household goods store owned by Anthony did bring in some income, but they never traveled to Bali, for example. And they lived not in a mansion but in an ordinary 3-bedroom apartment inherited from Anthony's parents. Where do you want to go? He asked. Shopping didn't work out, so at least have a meal, whatever your heart desires. The man was sure that Helen's heart would desire hamburgers and French fries that day. And that was better than wearing a skirt that would be embarrassing to step outside in. Everything was going more or less fine. As Anthony suspected, his daughter chose the most disgusting eatery among all in the shopping center. The tables in this cafe seemed unwashed. Everything was covered in crumbs. Loud pop music, which Anthony couldn't stand, blared in the room. But most importantly, there was no mention of healthy food here. The man went through the menu twice, but couldn't find anything edible. Helen watched his struggles for a while and gave advice. Dad, finally pick something. Take a hamburger. At least there's a lettuce leaf in it. You want to kill me? Anthony muttered. Poison me so I don't get in your way. If Nancy couldn't poison you, then nobody else can for sure, the girl replied. So don't be afraid of anything. Wash down the hamburger with Coca-Cola. Remember your youth. So, you think I'm an old man? The man asked. Well, thanks. To Anthony's surprise, the junk food he had been avoiding turned out to be quite decent. More than that, it was tasty. Helen fell silent and ate her pizza. Anthony relaxed, hoping that this would be the end of it. They would peacefully have lunch, then return home and go about their own business. Helen would lock herself in her room, using homework as an excuse, and wouldn't come out until the evening. Anthony, in turn, would watch the football match, even if it was a recording, just to find out how it all ended. Let the sounds of music come from Helen's room, and Anthony would fall asleep without seeing the penalty. But they would spend the evening peacefully, without disturbing each other and avoiding new arguments. Helen was only 10 years old, but her character was getting worse every day. The girl had entered adolescence. What could he do? Anthony even feared to imagine what awaited him in a couple of years. Would he have to fend off boys from Helen? Fight with his own daughter about fashion matters? Anthony struggled to endure a single trip to the store and couldn't imagine how he would cope if he had to deal with such things every day. We have a concert for International Women's Day at our school, unexpectedly said Helen, contemplatively staring at her slice of pizza. It seems to have begun, thought Anthony. The evening calm he had dreamed of a couple of minutes ago turned into a nightmare. Any wrong word could trigger a new scandal. Conversations with his daughter always felt like navigating a minefield. That's good, said Anthony. Will you be performing too? Helen nodded. Yes. Mandy and a couple of other girls and I have prepared a little skit. We'll perform it for the teachers. I hope no one will laugh. Who would laugh at you? Anthony exclaimed. You've been in the drama club for 3 years. You have more experience than all your classmates combined, including your music teacher who plays the same thing year after year. She learned 3 melodies and repeats them at every concert. To his surprise, these words didn't encourage or even make Helen smile. Dad, why do you say such things? She sighed. You've never seen me on stage even once. Well, now there's a reason to see, replied the manual. When is your concert? I'll definitely make time to come and watch. Well, you have your store, Dad. My store can wait. There are salespeople. They'll manage somehow. Helen looked at her father almost fearfully. Anthony couldn't understand what was going on. No, Dad, you can't come. Why not? Anthony asked. Parents were allowed before. I came to your performance in the 3rd grade, remember? You came. Helen nodded. But there were only moms in the audience. You were the only dad. That explains it. Anthony sensed danger. The word mom that Helen mentioned out loud only confirmed his suspicions. Not the only one, he said carefully. There was also this. Your classmate Phil's grandfather, or whatever his name was. The chubby one, always chewing gum. There was you and my classmate Phil's grandfather. Helen nodded. And everyone else, the moms and the teacher. You looked out of place there, Dad. You know, like in children's picture games where you have to name the extra object. This word extra struck Anthony. His daughter called him that, even though he was her closest relative. The only relative, you could say. Grandma Allison didn't count. She hadn't been interested in her granddaughter's fate for many years and, in general, lived who knows where. Extra, huh? Said Anthony. Thanks for the kind words. Really, Dad, it's weird, said Helen. Everyone else goes with their moms. And I go with you, like under guard. Even the saleswoman noticed. And you called her stupid yourself, mumbled the man. Helen pushed her pizza plate aside, leaned over the table, and whispered, Dad, tell me, where is Mom? You know what happened to her. She died, Anthony said. In an accident. I know, Helen said irritably. But how did it happen? You haven't told me the details. I don't want to talk about it, Anthony replied. Eat your pizza while it's still warm, and let's go home. We've wasted the whole day on nonsense. Helen looked at him angrily. Anthony realized he was behaving wrongly again, ruining everything once more. However, no matter how much he wished, he couldn't turn back time and take back his words. Now his daughter would shut herself off again, start tormenting him with silence and criticisms. And, oh God, he just hoped he wouldn't have to take her to a psychologist again. The girl squeezed the cardboard cup of lemonade so tightly that it crumpled. Anthony imagined how his daughter might wave her hand and spill the entire lemonade in his direction. But instead, she whispered, Dad, look over there. See the table near the exit. The table near the door was no different from all the others. Equally dirty. Although it seemed that the cafe had finally decided to clean up. A woman in a uniform appeared next to the table and started wiping it with a cloth. Anthony didn't quite understand what was so special about it. But he felt he had to say something about it. Cleanliness is the key to health, he said. Good for them for cleaning up here, at least occasionally. It seems he said something wrong again. Because Helen looked at him like he was an idiot. What does cleanliness have to do with it? His daughter asked. Dad, wipe your eyes. That's Mom. Anthony's heart tightened. It seemed that his fears about the psychologist were confirmed as Helen started acting strange again. His wife Jessica died 4 years ago. But the man remembered that time well. It was a blow for him, but it was even worse for his daughter. She asked 100 times a day when Mom would come home, and it drove Anthony crazy. The man tried various responses. Once he even said something terrible like never, but Helen persisted. Later, it got even worse. The girl began to recognize her mother in completely unfamiliar women she met on the street. Anthony could recall several occasions when his daughter, screaming Mom, rushed towards strangers. He remembered the disappointment on Helen's face when she realized it wasn't her mother. He awkwardly apologized to the bewildered women, making up some nonsense to distract their attention from Helen's reaction. Remembering those times, Anthony understood that he himself was not in the best condition. Whether it was from grief or from the sedatives that the man consumed in benches, there was always some kind of fog in his head. And what kept Anthony from slipping into alcoholism was only his daughter. The man couldn't imagine who Helen would be left with if he lost his human semblance. He had to hold on with all his might. Anthony had no one to turn to for advice. He was alone. Unexpectedly, his friend Lainey came to the rescue one day, suggesting, "Why don't you take Helen to a psychologist? They should understand such matters, or she might develop some phobias. Let a specialist advise on what to do." At first, Anthony was skeptical about these words. As a person raised by parents with stern views, he was distrustful of psychologists. What could some professional tell him that he wouldn't know himself? However, Anthony couldn't handle it on his own anymore. So, he followed his friend's advice and found a psychologist for his daughter. At first, this woman didn't excite much enthusiasm in Anthony. Or rather, not the woman herself, but how she looked. Exactly like a real professor, no doubt, with a bun on the back of her head, wearing glasses. This person seemed like she belonged in a movie, standing with a pointer over students and nitpicking every word. However, once the woman opened her mouth, that impression dissipated. Her voice and gaze softened when she addressed Helen, becoming almost maternal. Moreover, Jessica, Helen's actual mother, had never spoken to her so tenderly. "Helen, right, and I'm Mrs. Robin," she introduced herself. "You can call me Robin. How about some tea and pastries? Everything's already on the table." "She prefers lemonade more," Anthony muttered, not entirely sure how his daughter would react to this offer. Lately, Helen could throw a tantrum over anything, or even out of nothing. She was ready to burst into tears. "I have lemonade too," Robin winked. "Well, Helen, are you coming?" "Only with my dad," she replied. "Of course with him," Robin said, smiling at the man. "Anthony, how do you feel about soda? I hope it's positive because I don't have any other drinks prepared today." "Well, except for green tea." "Stay." These psychological sessions were not in Anthony's plans at all, but there was nothing else to do. He stayed, and later realized that it was the right decision. It would be mean to leave Helen alone, hiding behind the phone screen and immersing himself in some movie. However, later, Anthony could hardly remember what Robin talked about with his daughter. Only fragments of phrases remained in his memory. He didn't want to memorize all of this. Guilt tore at his heart. The psychologist talked to Helen carefully, finding out all the circumstances of Jessica's death. And she didn't even suspect that the culprit of what happened was sitting right here in her office. Anthony was a murderer. Perhaps, after what happened, he himself needed a psychologist. But turning to a specialist meant revealing his secret. The man preferred to take antidepressants. Fortunately, he easily obtained a prescription for them. It was enough to tell the neurologist some nonsense about endless sadness, and the necessary paper ended up in his pocket. It was easier than deceiving a child. And that's exactly what Anthony did to his daughter. No matter how skeptical he was about psychologists, conversations with Robin bore fruit. Helen gradually calmed down and stopped crying. The ghost of Jessica no longer haunted the girl. Rare flashes, like the one now in the mall, with the exclamation, "For what?" Anthony perceived with sadness and patience. It was his fault. He had to endure. But a new vision for Helen that was serious. So much time had passed since Jessica's death. Could this whole nightmare really start again? "That's Mom," exclaimed the girl, pointing at the waitress. Anthony scrutinized the stranger and cautiously said, "I don't see the resemblance. Something's off. Papa, buy glasses." "No, seriously. Mom had light hair, and this woman is a brunette. How are they alike?" "Actually, it's not the Stone Age. You can buy hair dye at any store. Maybe they sell it. But I didn't notice your mom's inclination towards goth. Unlike you, by the way, Anthony said. You take after Mandy in everything and want to wear all black. Papa, what does Mandy have to do with it? The girl replied. I'm asking you to take a closer look at this woman. She's a copy of Mom. Anthony stared at the stranger. He opened his mouth to object, but found no words. Unexpectedly, he realized that his daughter was right. The unfamiliar woman did resemble Jessica. If you ignore the hair color, she was an exact copy of his wife. The same upturned nose, sharp chin giving the woman a stubborn expression, height, figure. Anthony stared too long at the waitress and didn't react in time when she looked in their direction. The woman noticed his gaze, and her eyebrows lifted in surprise. It seemed she was asking what Anthony needed. She's looking at you, Dad. Yeah, Anthony said. Come here, please. Helen's bright voice echoed throughout the hall, causing the few cafe visitors to raise their heads and look in their direction. Anthony stared at his daughter in shock. What are you doing? Talk to her, Dad. About what? Please tell me. The waitress approached their table. She did indeed resemble Jessica a lot, but at the same time, she was markedly different. Take the scent of her perfume, for example. Jessica never used such scents. She preferred something light and flowery. Echoes of that fragrance still lingered in their closet. The waitress was enveloped in something citrusy, and there was a completely different expression in the eyes of this woman appropriate for an employee of a decent establishment, yet with a hint of mockery, as if she found Anthony's expression amusing. Hello, I'm listening to you, she said, addressing Helen as an adult. The girl froze and became flustered, unsure of what to say next or whether she should let her father take over the conversation. Anthony himself was lost. When he had gone to the shopping center with his daughter, he had never anticipated such an encounter. Everything was supposed to go quietly, peacefully. Arguments with his daughter didn't count. Those happened frequently. But the ghosts from the past weren't supposed to disturb them, especially the ghost of his late wife, who had decided to manifest not only to Helen but to him as well. The waitress raised her eyebrows again, looking at him questioningly. Anthony cleared his throat and pointed at the empty plates in front of them. Repeat the order, please. Of course. The woman took the empty plates and headed towards the cash register. Anthony kept staring after her. Even the stranger's gait was different, not like his deceased wife's. Jessica always had hurried steps, as if she were running late for something. He and Helen always walked in a perpetual skip, resembling two schoolgirls from the outside. The waitress moved as if she were royalty. Anthony didn't know where the word came from in his mind, but the associations were exactly like that. The woman's posture was regal, lacking only a crown on her head. She carried the tray with such dignity, as if it held golden relics rather than dirty plates and sugar packets. Another hamburger, Helen asked in surprise. Dad, are you serious? I thought you couldn't stand them. I can't, Anthony confirmed. What did you expect me to say? It was the first thing that came to my mind. But she looks like Mom. She does, tell me. No, Anthony lied. Not even a bit. Finish your lemonade and let's get out of here. I still wanted to work tonight. Helen brought the glass to her lips and replied discontentedly. She does look like her. You're just lying. This time, Anthony didn't accuse his daughter of rudeness because she was right. He was indeed lying. And what was worse, he was lying to himself. Without saying a word, he and Helen once again turned their gaze to the waitress. She was chatting with the cashier, smiling. Anthony's heart skipped a beat at the thought. That's it. Jessica used to smile like that. No, not quite. Jessica smiled shyly, as if apologizing for something. She was embarrassed in front of everyone. The stranger laughed, tilting her head back lightly and freely, not looking vulgar at all. Anthony caught himself thinking that he liked this laughter. There was not a gram of artificiality in it. The emotions were genuine. The waitress finally got their order and returned to them. Your order, she said, still smiling. Thank you, Anthony involuntarily smiled back. A sly expression appeared on the woman's face when she saw his smile, as if they were co-conspirators hiding a shared secret. "Call me if you need anything," she said and walked away. Helen watched the waitress as if enchanted. "It's not Mom," Anthony warned her. "Stop staring. We haven't figured out for sure if it's her or not," the girl stubbornly replied. "If it were your mom, she wouldn't behave like a total stranger," Anthony added. "Think about it. It's ridiculous. What if she lost her memory? Or someone kidnapped Mom, forced her to work here, and they're keeping an eye on her? For example, that girl at the cash register." Helen pointed at her. Anthony lightly slapped her hand. "Don't do that. I already told you it's impolite to point at someone. And about all your virgins, I think you've watched too many TV series. Maybe we should cut off your internet. It seems like you're not preparing for lessons there, but watching and reading all sorts of nonsense." The girl continued to gaze at the waitress. Anthony sighed. "If Mom were kidnapped, she would find a way to communicate it," he said. "She would send you a napkin with a request for help, for example." Helen looked at him, and he noticed tears shimmering in her eyes. "Dad, just be quiet for a bit," she said. "Do you think I'm so stupid that I don't understand anything myself? Just let me dream for a bit that we found Mom, and everything will be okay." Just like before, Anthony obediently fell silent. He could have told his daughter that things weren't as good as she thought they were before, threatened her with visits to the psychologist and cutting off the internet, come up with some other nasty thing that would undoubtedly bring Helen to tears and put an end to the whole story. Instead, he leaned over his plate and continued his lunch. The second hamburger was clearly unnecessary. Anthony struggled but still ate. There was no other choice. Occasionally, he felt the gaze of the waitress on him. It seemed that the strange visitors intrigued her. "Let's go." Anthony stood up from the chair. "Enough for today. So, we'll come again tomorrow," replied Helen. Anthony made a terrible face and handed her the coat. The girl was offended. Anthony didn't bother telling her that he had no intention of coming here again tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, or ever. He planned to avoid this place. After all, there were many similar eateries in their city, and healthy eating was still a valid option. "Have a good evening," the waitress wished him as Anthony paid and headed towards the door. He forced himself to smile. It probably didn't look very natural because the waitress smiled again and returned to cleaning the tables. On the way back, Anthony hardly spoke to his daughter. Occasional questions about whether she was cold, whether her feet got wet, and if she wanted to buy macaroni and cheese for dinner didn't count. Helen was immersed in her thoughts and almost didn't pay attention to him. Anthony realized that he wouldn't be able to reach the girl and fell silent. He couldn't get the image of the waitress out of his head. On one hand, it was Jessica. On the other, her complete opposite. Anthony couldn't make sense of his own feelings. It felt like he was drunk. Everything in his head had become too tangled, too unclear and contradictory. When they returned home, Helen immediately went to her room. "Should I warm up dinner for you?" Anthony asked. Helen slammed the door in front of him, and a few minutes later, music blasted from her room. Anthony frowned and went to his own room. "She'll come out when she's hungry," he decided. Moreover, he suspected that Helen had decent savings under her mattress for a rainy day. Snickers, crumbled cookies, and candies. Besides, junk food was still a guarantee that she wouldn't die of hunger. It was better for both of them to eat some junk for one evening than to collectively consume sedatives. Anthony settled on the couch and started replaying the match on his phone, but what was happening on the screen seemed to pass by without registering in his consciousness. He was so engrossed in thoughts about the stranger waitress that he missed a scored goal, his attention completely absorbed by thoughts of the unfamiliar woman. She was nothing like Jessica. Better or worse, he couldn't tell. Just different. Anthony had met his wife when he was in his last year of college. The specialty he chose at the insistence of his parents, industrial and civil construction, did not appeal to him. The only good thing about it was the scholarship. A friend of his father managed to get him a spot on the budget. That was where the prose ended. Anthony studied diligently because he was accustomed to it from school, but he had no clear plans for life. Everything was going with the flow. What he would do after graduation, the young man had no idea. Christy, his friend and the only girl in the group, and also the class president, called him a slacker. "How is it possible that you have no ambitions?" she wondered. "You're not an old man whose life is ending. In youth, everyone has some goals, desires. I don't have any," Anthony replied calmly, feeling no embarrassment about it. "I just want to live quietly, earn decent money, and not be bothered by anyone. I have no desire to be a boss. Let Laney boss everyone around. He's so into yelling at everyone in football." Laney, another member of their group, looked down on his friend condescendingly. "And I'll be in charge," he agreed. "And Anthony, the cream of the crop, works in management. Well, don't worry, you'll be working under me. I'll become the director, and I'll help you out." "Very sweet," Christy said. "So someone will be helping him for the rest of his life, whether it's dad's friend or best friend. Don't you think, Anthony, that you should learn to live independently someday?" "Don't worry, I'll take you on as my secretary too," Laney told her, earning a slap in the face. Christy was a strong-willed and strict girl, used to achieving everything on her own and not counting on handouts. Anthony was far from that. He was considered a slacker not only by his best friends but by everyone. Even teachers praised him in passing, paying more attention to Laney, who was less capable but more ambitious and sharp than. Anthony was quite content with this fact. He felt no envy towards anyone. However, the endless teasing and pranks from his friends irritated him. Once, he made a bet with Christy, and the friends were discussing what punishment to come up with for Anthony. There was no other way to describe their fantasies. Anthony was shocked by what his friends were devising for him. "We need to make Anthony dress properly," Christy said, and, with a contemplative look, glanced at him. Anthony was concerned that they would undress him right there in the courtyard of the college where they were sitting. "For how much money?" Laney asked. "If you want to be Anthony's sponsor, no problem. Just keep in mind that some Gucci pants will cost you a fortune. Are you ready for that? And don't make me change clothes," Anthony intervened. "I'm fine with how I look. Normal clothes from the store. Do I need to hang a price tag on my back to look cool?" "The clothes might be normal, but they're very boring," Christy retorted. "So you won't find any normal girl, and it's time you did. The diploma is coming soon. Knowing you and your diligence in your studies, you'll bury yourself in drawings at work and forget about your personal life altogether." This topic was unpleasant for Anthony. He tried not to think about his personal life, if only because there was nothing to think about. In the second year, Anthony briefly dated a girl named Bella, a future accountant. They met by chance during a philosophy elective, which, for some reason, was held jointly for future engineers and economists. Bella was a bit late for the class and had to sit in the only available seat, next to Anthony. She asked him a question about the lecture, and later, it turned out they lived near the same bus stop. These relationships developed very slowly and differed little from ordinary friendship. They chatted about life, discussed philosophy lectures, but it didn't go beyond that. Infrequent cheek kisses didn't count and brought more embarrassment than joy to the young people. Laney disliked Bella altogether, calling her slow and chubby. Although if the girl had any extra weight, it was no more than 5 kilograms. "What did you find in her?" his friend wondered. "She's a whore, not a girl. And she dresses in some granny's clothes. Did she inherit a whole chest from her grandmother? Or did the entire village gather clothes for her to send to the city?" "She's not from the village," Anthony objected meekly. "She lives in the suburbs. And her clothes are ordinary. Fashion and all that don't matter much to me. I prefer a simple girl to some bimbo who has no interests other than magazines and shops." Laney had broken up with a similar girl, a dancer from the student club. a couple of months ago and seemed to take offense, possibly interpreting Anthony's remark as a comment on him. "You're interested in fashion too. Don't lie," he said. "Just your own kind. Village style. That's what it's called. Depraved." Nevertheless, Anthony, not accustomed to much attention from women, was pleased with having such a semblance of a relationship. More precisely, a semblance of a relationship. Deep down, he liked to think that he and Bella were a couple, and he wasn't the ultimate loser at the university. After all, no one but him knew the whole truth. Bella was a rather straightforward girl. Her parents worked at a factory, and her aspirations didn't go beyond working in some office, dealing with perpetual accounts, tables, and budgeting. Just like Anthony, she spoke about philosophy with indifference. With the same apathy, Bella could discuss mathematics or the theory of physical education. One could even say that the two young people suited each other. Both were average, with no particular demands on life. Yet, their connection didn't last long. The next semester arrived, and philosophy disappeared from Anthony's schedule. With no more shared classes, they drifted apart not gradually, but suddenly, as if philosophy was the only thing keeping them together. It took Anthony some time to realize his feelings about it, probably a mix of sadness and relief. Now, he didn't have to play the knight, pay for Bella's bus fare, or discuss Plato's tedious works. Also, the teasing from Lainey came to an end. Christy, however, was concerned that Anthony was once again left alone. Still, Lainey assured her, he'll find someone better. He didn't. Until his 5th year, Anthony remained single. Now, his friends decided it was time to change that. "Exactly, a girl," Christy exclaimed. "Listen carefully. My wish will be for you to get married." "Got it. Do you think that's not going too far?" Anthony asked. "Don't you want anything more?" His imagination failed him. He had never argued about a wish before, and perhaps it wasn't worth starting. "At least not to get married, just get acquainted," Christy suggested. "Approach her and say hello." "Say, to whom?" Anthony didn't understand. His friends began scanning the university courtyard, searching for a suitable victim. "Maybe that girl with a ponytail on her head," Christy suggested, pointing to a girl in a light dress. "I think she'll do." Lainey skeptically looked at the stranger. "I would say yes if she were alone. Can't you see the crowd around her? If Anthony approaches her, he'll get trampled by the crowd." Chosen by Christy, the girl was indeed surrounded by friends. The whole group was laughing, and for some reason, Anthony had no doubt that if he approached, the laughter of the girls would only get louder. After such embarrassment, he would undoubtedly become a local celebrity, and a peaceful life would be out of the question. "That one," Lainey pointed to a tall, slender girl in high-heeled shoes. "Are you kidding?" Christy asked. "Anthony will faint. He won't even have time to say a word to such a lady." "And what kind of lady is she anyway?" "Just a nightclub regular. I bet she never leaves nightclubs." "What will Anthony talk to her about?" "They have nothing in common. So, we need someone like Bella," Lainey grinned. "Okay, there's a candidate. Look at the bench by the fountain. How about her?" Anthony wanted to protest, to send his friends and their wish far away, but he still looked at the stranger chosen by Lainey. At first, he didn't understand what this girl had in common with his ex. Bella was plump, while this stranger was slender. His ex had dark hair, and this girl's hair shimmered golden in the sun. Then it dawned on Anthony. Lainey often judged people by their style of clothing, searching for signs that weren't immediately apparent to Anthony himself. That's it. Was the girl dressed casually? Anthony couldn't figure it out at first glance. Ordinary jeans and a t-shirt roughly the same as what Anthony wore, just in a female cut. The young man felt a sympathy for her, like an unlucky person meeting a fellow sufferer. The girl sat alone, reading something on her phone. She probably wouldn't burst into laughter if he greeted her. "Anthony likes her," Lainey said. "I don't like her," Anthony protested, shaking his head. He had no intention of succumbing to these idiots and engaging in foolishness. However, Christy unexpectedly sided with Lainey. She likes you, whether you admit it or not, she said. It's written all over your face. Go say hello to her. Then you can run away if you want. Anthony tried to burn his friends with his gaze, but it had no effect on them. Lainey and Christy continued to look at him. Fine, I'll go, Anthony said. But for the next exam session, be prepared to fend for yourselves. Just so you know, I won't help. Clear. You haven't earned it. Christy nodded. Lainey remained indifferent. They knew these were empty threats. There was still a month until exams, and by that time, when they needed help, Anthony would, of course, come through. He wasn't good at staying angry for long. And don't even mention it, Lainey said. She's just some country bumpkin, big deal. They watched their friend go, like caring parents sending their son off to marriage. It irritated Anthony immensely. Walking towards the girl, he continued to ask himself how he let himself get involved in this story. Christy and Lainey often teased him, but this time they had gone too far. Maybe he really was a complete loser, approaching the first person he saw just because they told him to. The girl frowned as she typed something on her phone. Anthony stopped a meter away from her, unsure how to get her attention. Fortunately, the stranger noticed him and looked up. Hello, Anthony muttered. He didn't know what to say next. The girl remained silent too. To Anthony's surprise, she started blushing, and that lifted his spirits slightly. The girl clearly felt uncomfortable, but she had no intention of causing a scene. Anthony turned around. His friends continued to watch him, clearly expecting something. It disgusted him. Can I sit down? He asked. I'll explain everything. The girl nodded and moved to the edge of the bench. She held her phone tightly, as if preparing to defend herself if necessary. Lainey was right. She seemed like a typical modest girl from the village. However, Anthony saw nothing wrong with that. On the contrary, he felt the desire to protect the stranger from the mockery of people like his own friend. Sorry if I scared you, he said, sitting down beside her. It's just that. Well, you didn't scare me, the girl unexpectedly said. You just came up so suddenly, I didn't expect it. Her voice sounded unconvincing. It seemed like the stranger was struggling not to run away. I just lost a bet, Anthony confessed. You see those two idiots on the porch, the girl in the red jacket and the blonde guy next to her? Those are my friends. They made me come over and introduce myself to you. We were arguing about a wish, and now I'm fulfilling their request. So, you didn't want to come over yourself? The girl asked. Anthony sensed disappointment in her voice. I probably wouldn't have done it on my own, he admitted. The girl looked at his friends and became nervous. I don't like them staring at us, she confessed. It feels like I ended up on TV. Have you never wanted to be a TV star? Anthony awkwardly joked. I thought all girls dreamed of that. Not me, the stranger replied. I can't go on stage. I get lost, mix up all the words, and eventually faint. I didn't even like performing in kindergarten. Lainey and Christy continued to watch them closely, which began to annoy Anthony. Maybe we should go somewhere else, he suggested. These two won't stop staring at us. To his surprise, the girl blushed even more after these words, although it seemed impossible. Her face now resembled a ripe tomato. I can't leave, she said. I have to wait for my friend. Do you still have classes? Anthony guessed. Sorry, I didn't think. Well, all right. The girl shook her head. Not classes. Erica's supposed to bring me a raincoat from home. She left half an hour ago and hasn't made it here yet. It's unclear when she'll be back. A raincoat. Anthony wondered. It's so hot today. Although they promised rain later according to the forecast. I've been carrying my jacket around all day and don't know where to put it. The cloakroom isn't working. Did you specifically send your friend for a raincoat? The girl sighed. I'm not really cold. Just, well, I'll tell you if you promise not to laugh. I'll try. Anthony nodded, putting on the most serious expression he could manage. No, seriously, I won't laugh. The girl glanced at his friends again and whispered, I sat on a bench and stained my jeans. I didn't notice the wet paint sign. Anthony jumped up as if on a spring. The girl smiled. Not on this bench, in another place. Now I'm sitting here, waiting for Erica to bring me my long raincoat so I won't be embarrassed to go home. I don't want everyone pointing fingers at me. Now I get it, Anthony mumbled. Well, if that's all, maybe you could take my jacket. The girl looked at him in surprise. Anthony said, I just don't want Christy and Lainey to keep staring at us the whole time. I'll escort you home, and you can return the jacket. You can tell your friend you don't need the raincoat. The girl unexpectedly smiled, shyly, as if Anthony's proposal caught her off guard but was absolutely sincere. Thank you, she nodded. That's very kind of you. I didn't expect anything like this, really. Nonsense. Anthony waved his hand. Anyone can get into trouble, right? The girl put her phone in her bag and stood up. Anthony, shielding her with himself, put his jacket over her shoulders. It was unclear how long the girl's raincoat was, but the jacket did its job. It reached almost to her knees, reliably hiding the paint stains. Thanks, the girl repeated. Anthony didn't turn around to see the expressions on his friends' faces when they witnessed everything that was happening. Surely, they were in shock when Anthony and the girl walked off the university courtyard. After lunch, his friends were supposed to have more classes. Skipping them was a terrible act for Anthony. On the way to the bus stop, they hardly spoke. Both didn't know what to say. Talking on the bus was impossible. Rush hour, many people. Anthony thought the girl would return his jacket, and that would be the end of it. When the stranger spoke, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Jessica. And yours? Anthony, he replied, then added, maybe we'll meet again. Go for a walk. The girl nodded. Of course. Since then, about 10 years had passed. And, of course, they had changed. Lost their naivety. Grown older. Yet Anthony couldn't believe that Jessica could turn into the shattered person he saw in the cafe. Although something like that had happened once before. No, it's impossible. What was he even thinking? Jessica was supposed to be dead. The football match had ended, but Anthony couldn't recall the score. The music from Helen's room blared even louder. He approached and knocked on the door. Lower the volume, he shouted. His daughter either ignored him or didn't hear. Anthony sighed and returned to his room. It was only 7 in the evening. Going to bed early was out of the question. The music Helen was listening to resembled heavy rock more than a lullaby. Anthony didn't want to work, despite the stack of invoices that needed attention. He felt a strong urge to have a drink, and he fought against it with all his might. Eventually, his patience wore thin. Anthony grabbed his phone and found Lainey's number. Though they hadn't communicated much in recent years, Lainey was always available when needed. Anthony pressed the call button, and almost immediately, he heard Lainey's voice. Hey, cheerfully exclaimed Lainey. How's it going? What's the problem? You never called just like that. Anthony wasn't sure if there was reproach in those words or if Lainey was simply stating a fact. Upon reflection, his friend was right. Anthony usually thought about their friendship when something happened, like Jessica's death, or, on the contrary, her unexpected return from the afterlife, as it was now. I feel like having a drink, confessed Anthony. Oh, so there are problems after all. Your tone is too mournful, said Lainey. What happened? Something with Helen? No, replied Anthony. She's fine. It's just me. I get it, Lainey responded. I'm on my way. When and where? How about our ball? In about an hour. Sounds good, mumbled Anthony. What about your girl? Won't she mind you going out at night? He intentionally avoided mentioning Lainey's girlfriend by name. He didn't know who he was currently living with. Lainey changed girlfriends frequently, and remembering all the names was challenging. Right now, Anthony was only concerned about one girl, the one from the cafe. He didn't even know her name. The crucial thing was for her not to be Jessica. Anthony gathered himself and, stepping into the hallway, shouted to his daughter, I'm leaving. Heat up dinner if you need something. No response. Helen acted as if her father didn't exist. Anthony went out to the landing, turned the key in the lock, and almost immediately heard a rustle from the neighboring door. The man knew in advance what would follow, and he rolled his eyes. Escaping unnoticed from the apartment was impossible in his case. Anthony, hi. What's all the noise about? Some celebration, huh? His neighbor, Nancy, the same one, opened her door and stepped out onto the landing. She was wearing a short, colorful robe with images of palm trees and parrots. Her red hair was tied in a ponytail. Anthony always felt too hot and stuffy around her. He understood that it wasn't just the heavy scent of the perfume she used even in the apartment. Nancy was slightly older than Anthony, unmarried, but she hinted in every possible way that she wouldn't mind getting to know him better. However, Anthony pretended not to understand her hints. Yeah, Helen won some school competition, he muttered. I let her have some fun. Sorry, she'll turn it off soon. Nancy nodded. I always knew your daughter was a very capable girl, she said. A real smarty. You're very lucky with your child. Anthony smiled in response, though he didn't believe Nancy. He knew perfectly well that Helen and their neighbor couldn't stand each other. No sweet words or smiles could change that. Yeah, maybe, he muttered. Nancy, sorry, I got a call from the store. Some trouble with deliveries. She smiled even wider and waved her hands. Sure, I won't keep you. Actually, I came out to check the mailbox. The receipts were supposed to arrive. Lucky we bumped into each other. Anthony, you work so much that catching you at home is a real miracle. As he said goodbye to her and left the building, the man continued to ponder what interested his neighbor. Was it him or his store? It seemed that the correct answer was the latter. For unmarried Nancy, who worked at the checkout in a grocery store, owning a store must have seemed like a real treasure. But Jessica wanted more than that. She always dreamed of something bigger. Anthony arrived at the bar before his friend, contemplating the idea of a shot of brandy for warmth. Although, perhaps, he should be portraying an exemplary parent in his daughter's eyes and setting an example with his behavior. More likely, just a mug of beer tonight. Setting an example. Anthony smirked, thinking that tonight Helen wouldn't even notice when he came home. She wouldn't notice whether he returned or not. The main thing was for her to turn off her disco before the neighbors called the police. That's all he needed. More trouble. Hey, been waiting for me long, and immediately pointed at the beer. About 5 minutes, Anthony replied. Thanks for coming. It's nauseating to be alone tonight. Alone? Where's Helen? His friend inquired. In her teenage hysterics, Anthony muttered. We haven't been getting along lately, and it's getting on my nerves. Lainey remained silent for a moment and then said, You need a woman. And new problems. Anthony chuckled. Thanks. I have enough of those already. Lainey shrugged. I'm not forcing you to get married. Just meet someone, have some fun. Lainey had changed little since their student days. His voice sounded carefree, and his gaze was still serene. If you didn't see him, you might think you were talking to some 20-year-old guy. Yet, the years were taking their toll. A bald spot was forming on Lainey's crown. His face had lost its youthful features, and his figure had rounded. A small belly had appeared. Everything, as befitting a boss, even if a minor one. Lainey had achieved his goal, holding a small managerial position in the administration. He considered his friend's small store nonsense, claiming that Anthony was wasting his talents and time. Nothing had changed since their student days. Next to his friend, Anthony felt like a second-class person. It irritated him, but there was nothing he could do about it. You're confusing me with someone else, Anthony muttered. Such entertainments have never been my style. I remember. Anthony the old recluse. Perhaps it's time to stop blaming yourself for Jessica's death. Not enough. I did kill her, didn't I? Or not? Lainey looked at him in surprise. What do you mean? For a moment, Anthony pondered whether he wanted to tell his friend about what happened during the day. Was there any doubt that Lainey would consider his words nonsense? He would laugh at his friend's words, call him crazy. On the other hand, it wasn't only he who saw a copy of Jessica. Helen noticed her first. "It seems I saw Jessica today," Anthony slowly said, "in a city cafe." His words had an effect. Lainey almost choked on his beer. He coughed, put the mug back in place, and asked, "Buddy, are you okay?" "I'm fine," Anthony nodded. Helen saw her too, "So you can drop your advice about a psychologist." "I didn't imagine it." "Complete nonsense," Lainey muttered. "Not nonsense, but the truth." "But I can't understand how it's possible." Lainey looked thoughtfully straight ahead. Anthony awaited his verdict. "And what was she doing in the cafe?" Lainey asked. "Delivering food." "What was she doing?" "Working as a waitress." In simpler terms. A smirk appeared on Lainey's face. "Buddy, you've gone mad," he said. "Remember Jessica? She could never work as a waitress. With her clumsiness, she would have broken all the dishes in the cafe on the first day." That was true. Jessica really was like that. Clumsy wouldn't be the right word to describe her, but the girl had a strange talent for breaking all fragile things that came into her hands. "So, what was it then?" Anthony inquired. "This girl looked so much like Jessica, except her hair was black, but Helen said it was dyed. Yay, black hair, half a meter taller than Jessica. Eyes of different colors," Lainey said sarcastically. "Not funny. Otherwise, they were very similar." "Have you never seen a doppelgänger show on TV?" That didn't convince Anthony too much. "One thing is television, and another is real life," he said. "I saw this woman not on the screen, but in person. Just like I see you now." Lainey casually waved his hand. "There are no unique people, Anthony. Everyone looks like someone." Anthony realized that he wouldn't be able to persuade his friend otherwise. Perhaps Lainey was right. Maybe he and Helen had imagined it. Could his wife really come back from the dead? Anthony himself didn't know if he wanted that or not. His thoughts were in turmoil. "Pour me some brandy," he told the bartender. The bartender nodded understandingly. Lainey looked approvingly at his friend and raised a big thumb. "Now, that's what I understand." You were about to burst into tears there. "Pour me one too." A glass of brandy reconciled Anthony with reality. After the second one, he felt much lighter. Really, why did he get so worked up over some waitress? There are plenty of lookalikes in the world. This girl even behaved differently, not at all like Jessica. What a fool he was to mistake his wife for a stranger. They stayed in the bar until 11 in the evening, and then Lainey began to get ready to go home. "Important meeting tomorrow. Need to get some sleep," he informed his friend. "You wouldn't understand with your household goods." Lainey tried to make another joke at his expense. However, Anthony was too tired after this long day, and he didn't care. He had long been accustomed to his friend's teasing. When Anthony approached the door of his apartment, he didn't hear any sounds. It seemed Helen had finished her concert. Trying to move carefully to avoid waking his daughter, the man inserted the key into the lock. It didn't work the first time. Then the door swung open by itself, and Helen rushed into his arms. "Dad!" Anthony swayed in surprise, almost losing his balance. The little girl was crying. "Where did you go? You didn't even say anything to me, traitor. I knocked on your door, talked to you," Anthony mumbled. "I guess you didn't hear." After the evening spent at the bar, his tongue didn't obey him, and he preferred to stay silent. Besides, Helen wasn't listening anyway. She kept crying and repeating the same word. Traitor. Then, unexpectedly, his daughter stepped back, sniffed, and asked, "Dad, were you drinking?" Anthony spread his hands with an apologetic look. "I was." "You promised you wouldn't drink." "I promised I wouldn't go on a bender," Anthony replied. "Beer doesn't count. Besides, I drink it once every 5 years. You drank last month at some work party. It was Williamson's birthday, our best salesman," Anthony replied. I couldn't just sit there like a statue while everyone congratulated the birthday boy. In reality, that was a lie. In February, Anthony had another bout of sadness and had a shot of vodka. Of course, his daughter didn't need to know about it. You'll turn into a drunkard like Dylan's dad, and they'll take me to an orphanage. No one will take you, Anthony said. Where do you get such thoughts? The little girl sniffled and didn't say anything. In reality, Anthony had a suspicion about why this fear had taken root in her, and he feared that his daughter would speak the truth out loud. Long after Jessica's death, he fell into a binge. Short-lived, just for a few days. His cousin took care of Helen during that time. She filled the girl's head with all sorts of nonsense, telling her that if Daddy drank, the remnants of their family would crumble, and Helen would be sent to an orphanage. It was unclear what the woman was thinking when she told these horror stories to his daughter. Was she worried about Anthony? Did she seriously believe that a 6-year-old girl could keep him from making the wrong move? Did she want to scare Helen into behaving well and preventing Anthony from drinking? Or what? Whatever it was, since then, Helen had developed a peculiar phobia. Any mention of alcohol terrified her, and invitations to celebrations almost caused hysteria. We won't go to Uncle Dylan's birthday. She cried when relatives from the village sent them an invitation. You'll definitely get drunk there and end up lying under the table. When did that ever happen? Anthony protested. Never. But Dylan Dad always does that. Anthony had never seen this dad he was constantly compared to, but he felt a dislike toward him. For some reason, he had no doubt that Dylan's father, one of those alcoholics who always hung around the store begging for change, spent it on booze. Even now, mentioning this man irritated Anthony. I won't drink anymore, he said. I promise. You've said that before, Helen mumbled. Anthony thought someone was gonna get a tough wipe. In truth, his daughter was right. He had promised this before. I'm terribly tired, and my head hurts, he confessed. Maybe we should go to sleep. I have to get up early for work tomorrow, and you have school. Why haven't you gone to bed yet? I was waiting for you, Helen replied. I was scared something would happen to you, that you wouldn't come at all. Let's make a deal, Anthony requested. You won't play music so loudly that you can't hear yourself. And I'll try not to drink more than 1 mug per evening. Deal. Fine, the girl said with a sullen look and added, you could have left a note, and you could have called if you were scared, Anthony said. I was mad at you, Helen admitted. Then let's apologize to each other and go to bed. It's already midnight. Go brush your teeth. Half an hour later, watching his sleeping daughter, Anthony suddenly thought about what an idiot he had been, worrying about a stranger waitress. Did lookalikes matter at all when the main person in his life was here, nearby? Was it worth recalling the past? The night passed too quickly for Anthony's tired head to rest. But a short nap brought his thoughts into order. Seeing Helen off to school and getting ready for work, he didn't think about the waitress. He didn't remember her when he heard a radio advertisement for a new pizzeria. He didn't ponder over what this strange encounter actually meant. Although, who was Anthony lying to? Thoughts about this woman occupied his mind all morning. That's why, coupled with the hangover, he was so irritated. He couldn't concentrate on work and, for the first time, mixed up numbers in the documents. Why do we have so many locks? Williamson said, accidentally spotting his notes. We won't sell that many in a lifetime. We'll sell them, Anthony replied. Now I have an incentive to live until 100 to get rid of this heap of locks. He wasn't lying to his daughter when he spoke of Williamson as the best employee of the store. This old man was indeed a decent person, intelligent and understanding. He had worked as a manager for about 20 years until he was asked to leave and make room for the younger generation. Anthony suspected it was someone like Laney or another upstart like him, young and cheeky. Williamson, not used to sitting at home, didn't despair. After spending less than a week in retirement, he got a job at the household goods store. Anthony never regretted hiring him. Williamson worked better than the young ones, never allowed any shortages. But his insightfulness was sometimes out of place, like now. Anthony continued sorting through papers, and the old man stared at him as if making some mental calculations. Anthony wanted to ask what was on his mind, but Williamson spoke first. "Family problems, huh?" he said. Anthony shrugged. "Dutter's acting up. Typical stuff." Williamson continued to look at him. The gaze was not stern but rather paternal. Unable to resist, Anthony confessed. "Helen saw a woman in a cafe who looked like Jessica. Now she's all confused, and honestly, I am too." "I noticed," nodded the old man. "On what grounds?" Anthony was surprised. Maybe things were clearer from an outsider's perspective. After all, crazy people always think they're fine. "That's why you ordered so many logs," Williamson replied. "And it seems you were drinking yesterday." "Sorry for being blunt, of course. I was," Anthony awkwardly admitted. "Because of the Jessica thing. I lost it. And now, with these locks, it's like a snowball." Anthony felt very uncomfortable under Williamson's gaze. It was as if he were confessing his drinking problem to his father. The old man suggested, "Go home, take a break, Anthony. I'll keep an eye on the store. Don't doubt it. I'll handle everything in the best way." Anthony wanted to protest, say that he wasn't feeling that bad, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was a sense of gratitude. After all, Williamson was offering his help sincerely. "I guess you're right, Williamson. I better go," he muttered. "Thank you very much. I'll give you the day official, or better yet, two. Your help is worth a lot." The old man waved his hand in response. "Why take a day off? So I can sit on the balcony with my wife all day. Don't try to chase me away. Then I'll write you a bonus. Williamson, don't you dare refuse. Buy your wife a gift. She'll complain less. Go, Anthony. Hangovers make you think all sorts of things." Interaction with Williamson lifted Anthony's mood a bit, but it didn't dispel his thoughts about the waitress. Heading towards his car, the woman remained on his mind, and he turned onto the road leading to the shopping center. Anthony's hands seemed to know where to go, steering the wheel. There was still a chance that he might be stopped by the police halfway and fined for driving under the influence. However, that hope did not materialize either. Anthony had to rely on the possibility that the waitress had a day off. But this dream was not meant to come true. Barely stepping into the hall, he saw familiar dark hair. "In 5 minutes, your order will be ready," she said, addressing some family, then turned to leave. "Oh, God, Anthony." The waitress almost collided with him and froze, pressing her notepad to her chest. However, in a moment, her face took on an indifferent expression. "Excuse me," she said, "please have a seat. There's a free table over there in the corner. I'll be with you in a moment." Clacking in her high heels, she went to the cash register. Anthony watched her go. What was that? Auditory deception, or was it real? The waitress called him by name. Or was it hallucination? Anthony caught the curious gaze of a child sitting at a table and went to the corner where the waitress had directed him. He was intrigued by what was happening. He needed to stay in the hall as long as possible and observe the waitress's behavior. Perhaps the stranger was someone more significant than just her Jessica lookalike. Thoughts that it might be Jessica herself, Anthony still didn't entertain. It was too wild and fantastical. The waitress returned to him a couple of minutes later and handed him the menu. Despite Anthony scrutinizing her face, it remained calm. However, it didn't stay that way for long. Noticing the attention he was paying her, the waitress smirked and asked, "Is there something on my face or what?" Anthony shook his head, then gathered his courage and asked, "Tell me, have we ever met before?" The waitress raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Of course, we've met. Don't you remember?" "No." "Where and when?" "Yesterday, in this very cafe," the woman replied. "You came with a 10-year-old girl." "Completely forgot." Anthony felt like she was barely holding back laughter. To call this dialogue anything other than mockery was impossible. I remember that incident. He nodded. I meant something else. We haven't met before. If that were the case, I would remember. The woman replied curtly. I'll leave the menu for you. I'm needed at another table. I'll be with you in a few minutes. Take your time choosing. As she walked away, the man stared after her intently. He didn't miss how skillfully the waitress avoided giving a straight answer. She didn't say no. She sidestepped the question. He still held the menu tightly in his hands when the woman returned, looked at him slyly, and asked, "Have you decided on something?" Anthony shook his head. "No, it's all somewhat unsettling if you know what I mean." "Tell me, do you have a diet menu?" The woman rounded her eyes as if he were speaking Chinese. "The only menu we have is the one you're holding," she told Anthony. "So no, we don't have anything else." "Only pizza and hamburgers?" Anthony asked. "Yes," the waitress nodded. This place is a pizzeria, after all. It seemed she was starting to get angry, but she did it quite differently from Jessica. Anthony's ex-wife, when angered, would withdraw into herself and express her displeasure through silence. The waitress, on the other hand, seemed ready to flare up any moment, snatch the menu from Anthony's hands, and hit the customer over the head with it. Anthony realized he didn't like it. He hadn't felt such excitement in arguments with others for a long time. "So, there's absolutely no healthy food," he persisted. "What a disappointment. I might as well leave a negative review for your cafe. People come in, and there's nothing to eat. We have a salad that they put in hamburgers." The waitress replied with a cold smile. This remark reminded Anthony of his daughter's reaction. Helen had responded in a similar way when they came here together. Anthony set aside the menu and said tersely, "Call the manager. Right now. I want to file a complaint about your service." The waitress took the menu from him, turned around, and marched into the kitchen. Even her back expressed indignation. Anthony was certain that at that moment, the woman wanted to kill him, just dreaming about it. It seemed that the cafe's patrons had been watching their argument because a strange silence fell over the hall. No, the music continued to play, but all the voices hushed. Then some woman said, "People these days, causing a scandal over nothing." "Yeah, he's drunk," another voice replied. "Look at his gaze." Anthony tried not to blush and pretended he hadn't heard anything. He had never behaved like this in public before and felt a mix of shame and euphoria. What was this? Was it possible that yesterday's cognac had gone to his head? Anthony had no answer to that question, but he enjoyed the waitress's anger. She wasn't as invincible as she seemed. There was no mystique about her. She was just an ordinary person with her weaknesses. The manager, who approached his table, looked like a bouncer with a short haircut and muscular arms. Anthony didn't immediately realize whether it was a man or a woman. Strangely, this individual had a feminine voice. "Good day," she said, looking down at Anthony. "I am the manager of this establishment, and I was informed that you have some complaints about the work of our staff." Anthony glanced at the cashier. The waitress stood there nervously, tapping her foot and looking at him. The manager smiled widely and shook her head. "You've got something wrong." "I have no complaints. Quite the opposite. I would like to express gratitude. By the way, what's the name of this girl?" "The one who served you," the woman clarified. "Margot." "Exactly, her. I wanted to thank Margot for the polite and prompt service. We need more employees like her. And also," Anthony couldn't think of another way to praise the waitress and fell silent, embarrassed. The manager looked very surprised. "Well, I'll pass it on to her," the woman muttered. "Make sure you do." Anthony nodded. "And, by the way, give her this tip." He took out his wallet and handed the manager a bill. She took it cautiously, as if the money were counterfeit or an optical illusion. "Just to be sure," she asked, "So, you have no complaints?" "None," Anthony confirmed, "and now I need to go. Have a good day." "Goodbye." He stood up and walked towards the exit, accompanied by the stares of everyone in the establishment. A familiar voice spoke up again. "I told you the man was drunk." He wouldn't act like this if he were sober. Or insane, another voice added. Anthony didn't care about what others in the cafe were saying or thinking about him. He felt lighthearted, as if a heavy task had resolved itself. Margot was not Jessica. She was not his deceased wife. It had just seemed that way to both him and Helen. They hadn't gone mad. Anthony found himself thinking that he wanted a drink again, this time to celebrate the end of the investigation. All the past mysteries were left behind. There was no need for him to puzzle over the problems his wife took to her grave. Life went on. Wait. The waitress caught up with him right at the doors of the shopping center. What's going on here? The woman looked bewildered, angry, and anxious, anything but happy. Apparently, Anthony's complaints and the generous tip he left didn't bring her the slightest pleasure. What's happening? What did I do? Anthony asked. All this commotion. Do you understand what I mean? First, you were about to complain about me, then you praised me. What are you up to? There were many people around them. I changed my mind. I realized I was wrong to pick on you and decided to rectify my mistake. Make amends. Does that answer satisfy you? No, the woman replied. I'm sorry, but I can't offer anything else. Anthony turned to leave, but the waitress caught him by the elbow. Take back your tip. I don't need it. The woman almost forced the bill into his hand, but Anthony clenched his fist, preventing her from doing so. The paper currency fell to the floor. The waitress disdainfully pushed it away with her foot. Let's consider that I return the money to you. Take it. I won't, Anthony calmly said. They're not mine anymore. They're yours. And I have no use for them. Me neither, the woman angrily replied. I'll take care of myself. Are you okay? A security guard approached them, looking questioningly at Anthony. Everything's fine, he replied, keeping his gaze on the woman. From the man's behavior, Anthony noticed that the security guard didn't ask Margot the same question, as if the waitress wasn't someone whose opinions were worth inquiring about. You dropped some money, the guard said, nodding at the bill lying at their feet. Not me, the lady did, Anthony replied. I don't want your money, she retorted. Stepping outside the cafe, Margot tossed aside politeness. If only her boss could see her now. Before him stood a real fury. Why was he so persistent? If the lady didn't want to take the money, he should leave it be. Why force her? Do as you please, Anthony said. You can donate this money to charity if you want. As for me, I need to go and attend to my own affairs. I'm in a hurry. He stepped towards the door, but Margot followed him. Anthony started to get irritated. Why was she following him? What else do you want? He asked. It seems we've already discussed everything. Or am I mistaken? Helen came to the cafe today, the waitress said. Anthony thought he misheard. Who? He asked, astonished. Your daughter, Margot said more calmly. I thought you should know. And what did she want? Anthony asked. Probably the same thing you did. Margot smirked. Wanted to see me. Well, you know, I don't understand anything. How do you even know she's my daughter? The man inquired. Margot looked at him with disdain. What a fool. Probably from seeing you two together. In short, I need to get back to work. You're not the only one with things to do. Have a chat with your daughter yourself. She turned and walked away, just as proud and cold as before, as if there hadn't been any quarrel a few minutes ago. Anthony took out his phone from his pocket and dialed his daughter's number. She answered almost immediately. Hi. Why are you calling, Dad? Just checking in, he replied. Wanted to know how you're doing. What are you up to? What do you mean, what? I have lessons right now, his daughter said in surprise. Math, it seems, Anthony asked. Yeah, Helen replied. So what? Judging by her voice, she hadn't figured anything out yet. Are you sure? Anthony asked skeptically. Absolutely sure. So, if your class teacher calls me and says you're not at school, should I deny it all? Is that not true? Helen remained silent. Her father's knowledge of her truancy seemed to catch her off guard. So where are you, then? Anthony inquired. At home, Helen admitted. All right, I'll be there soon. And Helen, please make some tea. I'm starving. Anthony shook his head and walked towards his car. The waitress hadn't lied after all, and that was unpleasant. It turned out he could trust some stranger, Margot, more than his own daughter. Margot. Anthony finally learned her name, and it suited her much better than Jessica. She seemed like someone who should have a vibrant name. When Anthony returned home, tea and scrambled eggs were already waiting for him on the table, courtesy of Helen, playing the role of a cunning fox. She had prepared a quick lunch for him and now sat innocently at the table. A real angel, that is. If you didn't get to know her better, why aren't you at work? Helen asked. Anthony ignored her question. Scrambled eggs, thanks, he muttered. Why didn't you make some for yourself? I don't want to eat, she replied. You probably had chips, Anthony said. No, the girl protested. Right. Why would you need chips? Pizza is tastier, after all. Helen sighed loudly and looked at him in amazement. What pizza? She asked. You know which one. The one they serve at your favorite cafe. I don't know if you prefer it with pineapple or seafood. Anger slowly appeared on Helen's face. You're keeping tabs on me, she exclaimed, again, just like in the first grade. Through the phone, right? I thought you'd keep your word, Dad. I'm not keeping tabs on you, calm down, Anthony replied. Stop calling me a liar and a traitor for no reason. Then how do you know where I was? Helen asked. Margot told me. Who? Right, you still don't know her name. Anthony mumbled. The waitress at the cafe. The one who looks like your mom. It seemed like Anthony had managed to grab his daughter's attention. Once again, with the help of the waitress. Anthony felt like Helen was almost jealous of Margot. You talked to her, the daughter whispered. Today I did, Anthony replied. For the first time in my life. I swear to you, well, if you don't count our visit to the cafe yesterday when I placed the order, well, that probably doesn't count. Helen pondered his words and unexpectedly smiled. Why did you go there? She asked. Anthony found a catch in this question. But not understanding what to be wary of, he cautiously shrugged his shoulders. I wanted to take another look at this woman, understand who she is. Honestly, Helen, even I don't know, Anthony confessed. Helen clapped her hands. So, you also realize that she looks like Mom. Yet yesterday you scolded me. You really are a liar, Daddy. Whether I'm a liar or a traitor in your eyes, you never call me something good, Anthony muttered. And you skip work, just like I skipped school, his daughter added, and yet you nitpick at me. Unlike you, I don't have to endlessly take tests, Anthony replied. I have the right. His words didn't seem to impress his daughter. Anthony sighed and asked, what did you talk about? With Margot. Nothing special. I praised their pizza, said the cafe cooks really well. She asked if I needed a ride to school. Just as much of an egg as all adults. That's for sure, Anthony mumbled, remembering how the waitress almost attacked him over the tip. And that's it. Yeah, Helen said regretfully. Margot had a lot of work. Other customers came. We couldn't talk. And you didn't mention my name. Anthony clarified. The girl thoughtfully wrinkled her forehead. I don't think so, she said. We didn't talk about you at all. We didn't have time. I told you, Dad. Why are you asking? Just curious, Anthony replied. He had already learned everything he needed to know. Anthony's suspicions were not confirmed. Margot didn't learn his name from Helen. So, how did the waitress find out about him? It was an interesting question, and Anthony didn't have an answer. His initial encounter with Jessica was also oddly shaped. Seeing her home and arranging the next meeting, Anthony was horrified at what he had gotten himself into. What will I talk to her about? He asked his friends. Nothing comes to mind, and it might turn into a strange date. We'll just walk in silence and go our separate ways. Don't be so dramatic, Christy requested. What did you talk about with her the first time? And quite successfully, since you decided to invite the girl on a date. Honestly, I'm surprised at how it all turned out. "We're surprised," Lainey said. "I thought she would throw you into the fountain. And when I saw you giving her your jacket, I thought I was hallucinating. That just doesn't happen. Do you think everything will be okay?" Anthony asked, although he realized it sounded like childish whining. "Of course, everything will be fine," Christy replied unconvincingly. "A guy like you should eventually have some luck. Give her compliments," Lainey suggested. "Girls always like that. Especially since she seems cute." "But you said she's a country girl," Christy pointed out. Lainey was not at all embarrassed by that. "At first," he admitted, "but then I took a closer look. The girl is okay, suitable for our Anthony. She seems very shy," Anthony mumbled. "I don't want to scare her away with compliments." "You won't scare her away," Christy said. "Just be yourself, and everything will be fine." "Got it." Of course. It was easier said than done. Heading to the first date, Anthony felt his legs shaking. He hadn't been this nervous for any exam, neither in college nor in school. And to add to the pressure, his mother added fuel to the fire, bidding him farewell. "God help you, son, you deserve happiness." This, despite Anthony not saying a word at home about where he was going and why. Apparently, his mother figured it out on her own, observing how her son ironed clothes all morning and then spent an extra 10 minutes grooming himself in front of the mirror, something he doesn't usually do. Anthony felt like the hero of some silly reality show. The feeling was unpleasant, as if the whole world would be watching his date. Jessica was waiting for him in the park by the monument. It seemed like all dates in their town were appointed here. Anthony saw a couple kissing nearby and regretted choosing this place for their meeting. First, he could have shown originality and come up with something more interesting. And second, these kisses in close proximity bothered him. Anthony began to fear that Jessica would expect the same from him. Still, this was their first date. The bus ride didn't count. It would be strange to kiss a girl when you know nothing about her. However, his fears were unfounded. If Jessica was worried about anything at that moment, it wasn't the kisses but her own dress. The day was windy, and she was concerned about the skirt of her dress, which didn't rise too high. Coming closer, Anthony heard the girl cursing. Darn. It was so unlike the modest girl he met by the fountain that the young man stopped in amazement. Jessica straightened up and looked at him. At first, Anthony thought she didn't recognize him, but then a smile appeared on Jessica's face. "Hi," she said a bit hesitantly. Now, this sounded more like the girl he knew. Anthony convinced himself that he must have misheard the word darn and smiled in response. "Hello. So, where are we going?" he asked. The girl didn't answer right away. She looked at him, seemingly studying him with her eyes, forming some opinion. Anthony looked back at her. Jessica had changed in something. Something about her appearance was different from how he remembered her. Maybe it was makeup. It seemed she applied a bit more around her eyes. Anthony wasn't an expert in these things, but her face seemed unfamiliar. The same hair, the same height, the same eyes, everything was the same, yet different. "I'm just going crazy with nerves," the young man decided. "That's why I'm seeing things." Jessica also looks unsure. Understandable. We're almost strangers. And shouldn't it be the guy who decides? The girl finally asked. "Decide what?" Anthony didn't understand. "Well, come up with a walking route. Isn't that something the guy should do?" Anthony froze. He had no idea about what and who should do what, and what rules existed for dates. It was already a relief that he didn't forget to buy a flower for Jessica. "This is for you," Anthony said, avoiding answering the girl's question and handing her the rose. "A red rose," Jessica murmured, briefly pressing the flower to her nose. "Thank you. Okay, then, I'll choose the route. There's a cafe nearby. I haven't been there in a while. Let's go in and see what desserts they have. Maybe there's something new." Mentally berating himself, Anthony followed her. Jessica was entirely right. It was up to him as a man to take the initiative and plan the route. Instead, he hadn't thought about anything, arrived at the location, and waited for a cultured program to be prepared for him. Organize a city tour. Shame, he called himself. A complete idiot. Jessica looked at him and asked, "Why are you so tense?" Anthony shrugged. "It's a bit awkward. Second time we're meeting." The girl unexpectedly winked at him. "The second time is not the first. Okay, let's chat about something. For example, about studies. Whom are you studying to become?" "A builder, an engineer," Anthony said. "But I'll specialize in construction, that's for sure." "So, you'll be building houses at home?" the girl asked. Anthony shook his head. "That's unlikely. Actually, I haven't decided yet what I'll be doing. But construction isn't very interesting to me, honestly." "Really? Then why did you choose that specialty?" Jessica wondered. "Because there were budget places available," Anthony replied. It wasn't the best time to tell her about the connections with his father that helped him get into the institute. "What about you? Why did you decide to become a translator?" Jessica rolled her eyes. "Because it's a necessary and in-demand profession. Translators make good money, and perhaps I'll get to travel the world. In general, it's all nonsense, really." Anthony felt that the girl was repeating words she wasn't enthusiastic about, perhaps echoing her parents. It could well be that Jessica's fate, like his own, was decided by her parents. "Why is it nonsense?" he asked. "Because, at best, I'll end up as a secretary. What use are translators in our town? And trips to Europe as well. There are only big enterprises here, and why would they need translators? Maybe in a grocery store, but foreign language is not required there. The dialect of alcoholics will be translated into the language of sober people by the sellers themselves." Anthony listened to the girl and was increasingly amazed. She was a year younger than him, but reasoned so wisely and thoughtfully, as if she were much older. Where was the modest Jessica he expected to meet? Next to this girl, Anthony himself felt like a boy. Jessica suddenly stopped, looked at him, and asked, "Listen, did you not mention something during our last meeting about wanting to start your own business since you don't want to work as an engineer?" "I think I did," Anthony said. Now that idea seemed foolish to him. All his plans, his entire future, it was all unclear. Why expose himself to ridicule and talk about it to others? Such behavior seemed like blatant bragging. Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "Then it's clear." "What's clear?" "These are just plans, dreams, ordinary fantasies. Don't mind me, I sometimes talk nonsense." "No, it's okay," Jessica smiled. "I understand that you're a promising guy with big ambitions. It's admirable, really." And again, Anthony couldn't discern from her voice whether Jessica was sincere or mocking. This new version of Jessica left him bewildered. He couldn't understand what was happening. Unexpectedly, the girl froze, gazing somewhere to the side. Anthony couldn't figure out what she was looking at. Then he noticed an elderly woman near the nearest house. She wasn't shouting or crying, but she visibly exuded extreme nervousness. "Let's go take a look," Jessica said. "Maybe something happened." The old woman looked neat and clean, dressed in a snow-white blouse with a matching hat and well-groomed curls. An ideal grandmother from a picture. A typical retired professor. She didn't curse or cry, only her face expressed a profound sense of despair. The young people approached her cautiously, almost tiptoeing, maintaining the same silence. "Hello," the young woman said politely. "Is something wrong with you?" The elderly woman nodded. "I've lost the keys to my apartment," she said. "Now I'm standing here, not knowing what to do, who to call. My son is far away in another city, and the neighbors are all women. I'd like to call someone. I just don't know who to ask for help. Have you checked thoroughly?" "Are you sure the keys aren't in your bag?" Jessica asked. "Absolutely," confirmed the woman. "I've checked twice, rummaged through the entire bag. No keys." She looked at the house and sighed heavily. "Oh, how is my Rose doing? She's only 6 months old. It's not good to leave her alone for so long." Jessica also looked at the house. "Which window is yours?" she inquired. Anthony looked at her in surprise. He didn't like the direction the conversation was taking at all. The only reason a girl could ask about windows was if. No, he didn't even want to think about it. The ones on the second floor, the woman replied, with lace curtains. That apartment could only belong to one person. Lace on the blouse, on the hat, and on the curtains, of course. The window was slightly ajar. Jessica began to think out loud. The apartment is on the second floor. There's a store below. If we climb up the tree to the store's roof, we can easily get inside and open the door. A piece of cake. Easy. Anthony could argue with that statement. The shining look in Jessica's eyes as she gazed at him raised unpleasant suspicions in the young man. Are you saying we have to climb through the window? He asked cautiously. I mean, I have to. Jessica shrugged nonchalantly. I can do it, too. What's the big deal? Just my dress. Of course, I wouldn't want to show my underwear to the whole street, but for a good cause. Wait a minute. Anthony interrupted her. Even his ears turned red from her words. I can handle it myself. And don't forget, there's a baby in there, the girl reminded. This woman is right, you can't leave a baby alone for so long. I remember, Anthony mumbled. He himself didn't understand how and why he got involved in this story. Their date didn't go at all like they show in movies. It was nothing like what Lainey had described. At least, Anthony's friend had never thought of breaking into other people's apartments. Only a strange girl with a split personality could come up with something like that. And now she was looking at him with a mocking gaze, as if asking, well, how about it? Anthony approached the tree and looked at it with hesitation. He wasn't weak, but he wasn't an athlete either. His own physical condition suited Anthony. But climbing trees was something he left behind in childhood, and now he doubted if he still had the necessary skills. Anthony got lucky. The tree turned out to be just right, in the sense that finding a more suitable trunk with that many branches and cracks would be difficult. Rubbing his palms against the rough bark, Anthony struggled to climb onto the roof of the store. The old woman below fretted and waved her hands. Just don't fall, please, she exclaimed repeatedly. Oh, why did you have to climb up there? It's okay, he'll manage, Jessica replied, then shouted to Anthony, I believe in you. It seemed like she was speaking sincerely. Anthony looked at her. Jessica's eyes, her face, seemed to radiate a glow. She no longer looked prickly and mischievous. She was watching him like a hero. Anthony opened the window and, carefully stepping over the windowsill, found himself in the kitchen. Everything here gleamed with cleanliness, like in an advertisement. White dishes on the shelf, a white kitchen set, white linoleum, and a faint smell of medicine. Moreover, there was complete silence in the apartment. Wherever the unknown rose, the old woman's concern might be, she didn't rush to greet the guest. Oh yes, she's only 6 months old. Anthony walked into the room when a cat suddenly darted towards him. It arched its back, hissed, and began to retreat. Anthony beckoned it with his finger. Kitty, kitty, are you Rose? Or is there someone else here? The cat cautiously approached him and sniffed his hand. Anthony petted it, and the fluffy mistress of the house gradually calmed down. He picked her up and headed towards the door. Right on time. Jessica and the old woman were already in the stairwell. Is everything okay? The girl asked excitedly. And did you find the baby? It seems so, Anthony said and handed her the cat. Here. What do you mean? Rose. The old woman, barely holding back tears, reached out for her. My good girl. Got scared. Oh, I'm sorry, my dear. Won't do it again. Is this Rose? Jessica asked, bewildered. The young couple watched for a while as the old woman comforted the cat. Then they stepped into the stairwell and started laughing. I thought, Jessica said through laughter, that you were saving a child, and it turned out to be a cat. Well, no matter. It's still a heroic deed. Oh, come on, Anthony waved off. What heroics? Not everyone would have done the same as you, the girl retorted. It takes not just courage, but kindness. And quite unexpectedly for Anthony, she kissed him on the cheek. Why Anthony remembered that day so well, it's hard to say. Maybe because of the kiss or because of his so-called heroic act. He didn't have to climb trees anymore. Nevertheless, he understood that it wasn't about that. The reason he remembered that day so well was Jessica. She was never as lively, sincere, and bold again. They both seemed replaced. Then there was only a dull, ordinary life. Many years passed until the day he met Margot. If Anthony hoped to shake off the obsession by encountering the waitress again, his hopes were not realized. The morning after his latest visit to the cafe, he woke up with a headache once again. The sensation resembled the deepest hangover, yet Anthony knew it had nothing to do with drinking. He had spent the night pondering why some stranger from the street looked so much like Jessica. Anthony didn't believe Lainey's suggestion about doppelgängers. It was something else, and he was determined to find out what. This meant Anthony was facing another trip to the cafe, for the umpteenth time. The main concern was that Margot, angered by the tip drama, might kill him right on the doorstep. Anthony rightly reasoned that if he brought the child along, they definitely wouldn't kill him. So he decided to bribe his daughter, Helen, about yesterday. He began hesitantly. "Dad, I get it," the girl interrupted. "I won't skip school anymore. And I'll come up with something to tell Mrs. Hobbs. She's kind. Probably won't scold too much." "That's not exactly what I meant," Anthony mumbled. "What then?" "I wanted to suggest you skip the last 2 classes and go to the cafe again." The girl finally tore her eyes away from the mirror and looked at her father in amazement. "Dad, are you serious?" "Absolutely. We'll order your favorite pizza, get some lemonade, and hang out for a bit." "Sure, I'm in," the girl smiled. "But I have rehearsal after classes. I can't miss it. Let's go to the cafe in the evening." "Deal," Anthony nodded. "I'll pick you up at 5. Wait for me on the porch." Anthony realized that it might even be for the better. He could finally focus on work. But deep down, he felt disappointed. He wanted to go to the cafe right now and talk to Margot again. About what? Anthony had no idea. But he hoped this meeting would go better than the 2 previous ones, where he and the waitress had exchanged a lot of unnecessary words. Work temporarily pushed thoughts of the upcoming evening out of his mind. Anthony tried to pull himself together, thinking about his daughter, who needed to be fed, and the store employees who needed to be paid. He made an effort to be attentive to the documents and not order a bunch of unnecessary stuff. When Anthony arrived at the school, Helen was waiting for him on the porch, as they had agreed. Seeing her father, the girl smiled joyfully and ran to the car, waving a piece of paper. "Here," she said, settling into the back seat. "This is for you." "For me?" Anthony asked in surprise. On the extended sheet of paper were depictions of poppies and gladioli. "Are you sure? It says Happy Women's Day. Seems like it's not my holiday." "Dad, you're so silly," the girl said. "Give this drawing to Margot, and you'll instantly get along." "What's unclear here?" "Maybe also say that I drew it to make a good impression on her." "You can say that," Helen nodded. "I don't mind. Why are you coming up with such nonsense?" Anthony asked and returned the drawing to her. "You drew this. You should give it. At my age, it's not dignified. Margot will think I go to kindergarten. Then buy her flowers," the daughter suggested. "Why? We hardly know each other. So get to know each other." "Forget it, Helen." Anthony waved his hand. "You always come up with some nonsense. We're just going to the cafe to eat pizza. Remember? I remember. I remember." "That's our official version," Helen said, sighing quite grown up. "Dad, if you ask me not to lie, then please don't do it yourself. You're not good at it, actually. Just tell the truth." When they pulled up to the cafe, a dreadful thought crossed Anthony's mind. What if Margot had a day off? A person couldn't be clearing tables every day. Then they would have come for nothing with Helen. Fortunately, Anthony's fears were unfounded. As soon as he stepped into the hall, he saw familiar dark hair. Margot was serving customers. Helen tugged at her father's hand. Dad, there she is. I see, Anthony whispered. Remember the official version? We came here for pizza. Yeah, I remember, Dad. Although all of this is horribly silly, Margot turned around and saw them. She rolled her eyes and muttered something. Helen marched forward. Anthony followed her, standing behind his daughter like a shield. Good evening, Margot politely said. Take a seat at the table. I'll bring you the menu in a moment. Her mocking look didn't quite match the words she spoke, but it didn't bother Anthony at all. He smiled in return. Hello, thank you. Come on, Helen. Choose any seat you like. Helen's shoulders were shaking. Apparently, she found this conspiracy amusing. She plopped down at a table and turned a radiant face to her father. Dad, you came up with everything so well. It seems Margot is happy we're here. Yeah. Anthony skeptically inquired. To me, it seems like she's just waiting for the right moment to spit in our pizza or slip a laxative. Trust me, she's definitely not glad to see me. What? She is glad, and very much so. How can you see that? Margot approached them and placed the menu on the table. Helen handed over her drawing. Please take it, she said with unexpected shyness. It's for you. For me? The woman asked in surprise. Helen nodded, then became completely embarrassed and added, Dad drew it. Anthony flinched and suddenly showed his daughter a fist. She flashed a smile. All clear. She didn't want to embarrass herself. Embarrass her father instead. Or maybe she was getting back at him for hiding behind her. Really? Margot raised her eyebrows and looked at Anthony. You're quite good at it. I try, he casually replied. By the way, I graduated from art school. Actually, that wasn't entirely true. He attended art school for just a year, back when he was in the 3rd grade. Anthony didn't like drawing at all. So, if needed, you can draw my portrait, Margot asked. Only if it's in the style of Impressionism, Anthony said. If you like that, I'll pass, she smiled. But thanks for the drawing. And to you, Helen, too. The waitress went to the kitchen, and Anthony looked at his daughter. Do you think she didn't realize that you drew it? Maybe she did, Helen agreed. But that's not the main thing, isn't it? Anthony wondered. I thought you blamed everything on me because you were embarrassed. Of course not, the girl replied. I made a good drawing. What's there to be embarrassed about? I just wanted you and Margot to talk a little. Connect. Anthony mimicked her. Where did you get all these words? And why do you need this? Helen was silent. Anthony asked in a whisper. Did you decide to become a matchmaker? Helen looked away and mumbled, That's an ugly word. So, you did decide, Anthony remarked. Helen, what nonsense is going through your head? She's not your mom, just a complete stranger. Why do we need her? A complete stranger, the girl agreed. But a very nice one. You barely know her. I'm good at understanding people, Helen replied. They ordered pizza and began to eat without much appetite. Anthony was already regretting bringing his daughter here. Not only were various thoughts coming to his own mind, but his daughter was also fantasizing about something unclear. She had decided to set him up with the first available waitress. Could it be true that she missed her mother so much that she agreed to a look-alike? Anthony felt fleeting feelings of offense. It seemed that having just one father wasn't enough for his daughter. The cafe was filling up, and almost all the tables were occupied. Anthony observed Margot, who moved around the hall with a tray. Graceful, as if the hall weren't cluttered with plates. He found himself thinking that he enjoyed watching this woman, because people like to watch 3 things: fire, water, and other people's work. A voice in his head spoke, remarkably similar to his friend Lainey's voice. Anthony shook his head. It wasn't about that. It was just that in all of Margot's movements, there was a certain liveliness. She didn't look plastic or unnatural like some other waitresses. She was different. Helen also observed Margot for a while, then began to turn her head, studying other customers. After a while, she nudged her father with her elbow. Dad, look, "There's some strange guy sitting over there." "What's strange about him?" Anthony asked, not taking his eyes off the waitress. He's also staring at Margot. Doesn't take his eyes off her, and he hasn't ordered anything, although he's been sitting here for half an hour. Anthony turned around to see where his daughter was pointing. The unkempt man sitting a couple of tables away did look suspicious. First, he hadn't taken off his jacket, and as his daughter noticed, he hadn't ordered anything. Second, the stranger's gaze, following Margot's every move, didn't convey much kindness. And thirdly, Anthony himself felt that something was off. His inner voice was screaming, "Danger." And Helen echoed his sentiment. "Do you know what's strange here, Dad?" she whispered. "The fact that the free tables are almost gone, and no one is kicking that guy out. And overall, it's like nobody sees him except us. Maybe he's a ghost." Anthony looked at the waitstaff. They indeed avoided the stranger as if he were invisible. No one offered him a menu, smiled, or asked what he wanted to order. Waiters didn't even risk approaching his table, as if there were a dangerous zone around the unknown man. Now Anthony noticed that Margot had changed too. The woman still smiled, but her gaze became tense, almost frightened. She no longer walked around that part of the hall. Other waitstaff, as if by some silent agreement, took on part of her duties. "I don't like all of this," Helen said. "Me neither," agreed Anthony. His daughter looked at him with concern. "Dad, we can't leave Margot alone with him," the girl said. "What if he does something? What can he do?" Anthony mumbled, though deep down, he agreed with his daughter. The stranger's entire appearance, deeply set eyes, low forehead, stubble on his chin, gave away a criminal, or, at the very least, a suspicious character. Anthony wouldn't risk leaving Helen with such a guy. Suddenly, he realized that Margot felt the same way. For some inexplicable reason, Anthony felt responsible for her, as if she were truly his woman. "What time does this cafe close?" he asked his daughter. "Probably, like all the stores around here, at 9, she replied. "Why, nothing. You can choose anything else from the menu, whatever you want." It seems like we'll be here for a while. Time dragged on too slowly. After a couple of hours in the cafe, Anthony began to suffer from boredom. Why didn't he think of bringing his laptop and working at the table? There was still hope that the suspicious stranger would get tired of waiting and leave the cafe before them. But that didn't happen. He possessed incredible patience. He sat and observed Margot as if glued to her. In general, the usually peace-loving Anthony began to feel anger. What did this guy want? And most importantly, where was security? Why didn't any of the staff call a guard and kick this guy out of the hall? Were they also scared? Or did they not want to meddle in other people's business? After all, it wasn't them being scrutinized like zoo animals. Only Margot. Anthony was ashamed to realize that he had been doing the same thing. Hadn't he come to this cafe just to watch her? The cafe was gradually emptying. Soon, only Anthony with his daughter and the stranger, whose tongue could not be called mysterious but rather eerie, remained in the hall. "Sorry, but we're closing in 10 minutes, said one of the waitresses, not Margot, addressing Anthony. "We know, thanks," he nodded. "Will you also tell the man at the third table? Or is he chosen to stay here after closing?" After spending almost 4 hours in the cafe, Anthony had learned a lot for himself. He knew the table numbers, almost memorized the menu. The waitress standing before him now, Anna, glanced at the stranger and awkwardly smiled. "Of course, I'll tell him too," the girl said. But she did not fulfill her promise and hurried to the kitchen. Margot peeked out from behind the counter and looked at Anthony. He raised his eyebrows questioningly and nodded towards the man in the jacket, as if inquiring what was going on. The woman shook her head. "Everything is clear. He wants to say that all this is not his business. But we'll see about that." Anthony crossed his arms stubbornly on his chest, showing everyone that he wouldn't leave the hall before that suspicious guy in the jacket. No one paid attention to him and Helen anymore. Margot, already fully dressed in a coat and hat, walked out of the service area and headed for the exit. The stranger immediately stood up and blocked her way. "We need to talk." The waitress glared at him angrily. Such a look could ignite objects. Helen pulled Anthony's sleeve. "Help her, Dad. Can't you see what he's doing?" Anthony didn't need to be asked twice. He had become so angry during the forced boredom that he wanted to hit someone. Anthony even knew exactly whom. The waitress said something quietly. Anthony couldn't hear what exactly. The stranger grabbed her shoulders. "Margot, why are you resisting?" He said, "Let's go home." Anthony completely lost his mind at this scene. "Get your hands off her," he shouted. The stranger didn't even think about obeying the order. He continued to grip Margot's collar, shifting his astonished gaze between her and Anthony. "Who is this?" he asked. "Are you with him now or something?" To the surprise of both men, the waitress nodded. Anthony lost his patience. He roughly pushed the man aside and asked, "Got it? Get out of here before you really get it." "That's still a question of who will get it," he replied, looking at Margot. "Well, goodbye, Margot. We'll see each other again." Swaying noticeably, he headed towards the exit. Margot and Anthony watched him go. The other employees probably looked at both of them, but Anthony didn't notice. With no opponent around, Margot immediately lost control and whispered, "Oh, God." Helen left the table and ran to her. "Margot, are you okay?" she asked, grabbing the woman's hand. "You're not going to faint, are you? Because of all this?" she asked. "No, but I can't say I'm fine. Maybe you should sit down," Anthony suggested. Margot turned around, met the gaze of one of her colleagues, and shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I want to leave here. I don't want to see their sympathy. Not now. Please escort me to the bus stop. I can take you home," Anthony muttered quietly. "We came by car." "No, that would be inconvenient," the woman replied. "It will be inconvenient if this guy meets you again at the entrance," Anthony said. "Let's go already. We're standing here like on a stage." Helen returned for her backpack, and the three of them exited the cafe. Silence filled the room. Anthony was sure everyone was just waiting for Margot to leave so they could start discussing what had just happened. The girl once again took Margot's hand and walked beside her, looking at Margot's face. Anthony, unable to contain himself, simply asked, "Who was that?" The question was probably too personal, but the man couldn't resist. Anthony expected Margot to say, "It's none of your business," but instead, she replied, "My ex-husband." Anthony nodded, not knowing what else to say. After Margot's confession, the stranger became even more repugnant in his eyes. "You probably think I'm an idiot for marrying someone like him," Margot mumbled. "But before our wedding, Mike wasn't like that at all. It took me a couple of months to realize what he really was. Nothing good," Anthony muttered. The fact that a girl like Margot chose such a reject deeply saddened him. Why is life so unfair? "He won't come back," Helen promised. Dad scared him off, well. Margot tried to smile through her tears. "I hope so," she whispered. "Thank you for standing up. Although you probably shouldn't have gotten involved. It's up to me to decide what I should or shouldn't do," Anthony replied. "You just don't know Mike. He's a dangerous man," Margot objected. "He's just an alcoholic, that's all," Anthony said, approaching the car. "Get in, it's getting late. Let's go home." Throughout the entire drive, he glanced at the rearview mirror. Helen and Margot still held hands. Margot sat, facing the window, but Anthony could see that her cheek remained wet from tears. Above all, he wished to return to the shopping center and look for Mike. Maybe he hadn't gone far yet. Anthony didn't know what he would do if they crossed paths again. Most likely, nothing good. The fact that Margot was capable of crying puzzled Anthony. This woman seemed strong and resilient, nothing like his Jessica. Now, Jessica was a crybaby. She could burst into tears over a sad movie, an internet video, an unsatisfactory exam result, or practically anything that didn't go her way. Sometimes Anthony felt like the girl who rushed to help the old lady and wanted to climb onto the roof was just a dream. They had been dating with Jessica for about a year before deciding to get married. Anthony had graduated from college, and Jessica was in her final year. Her mother, Michelle, began dropping hints about marriage. "Isn't it time to officially formalize your relationship?" she would say, fluttering her eyes. "Running around like school kids, going to movies and cafes, it's not dignified at your age." "I'd be happy to," Jessica would smile. But Anthony isn't ready yet. He needs to stand on his own feet after college, save up for an apartment. "Earning is, of course, good," her mother said. "But how long can it take? A year, 2? With your salary, my dear Anthony, we could be waiting forever." These words embarrassed the young man. During the first 2 years after college, he worked in his field, as his parents insisted. He found a position in a small company but earned peanuts. Moreover, he didn't enjoy the engineering role. Now, his future mother-in-law was practically calling him a pauper. "I'm not against marriage at all," Anthony retorted. "It's Jessica. I don't know. Would you agree to marry me?" For a moment, Jessica pursed her lips, then nodded. "Of course, I'll do, silly." In the following years, Anthony often thought that this phrase was crucial. It frequently seemed to him that Jessica accepted his proposal only because she didn't find another, more worthy candidate. Many indeed considered his fiancée to be a simple girl. Although, for example, his friend Lainey, who could find fault with anyone, said at the wedding banquet, "Your wife is quite something. How did I not notice her before?" Anthony looked at Jessica, who was talking to the guests at that moment. His own bride had always seemed beautiful to him, but now, in the pristine dress, with her hairstyle and makeup, she became simply irresistible. "Be careful with that," Anthony joked. "Decided to hit on my wife. Too late now. You should have done that earlier when we saw her by the fountain, and now it's too late." Lainey stared at Jessica for a few more moments, as if not hearing the words spoken by his friend, and then nodded. "Indeed, what am I thinking? So many girls around. I'll have some champagne now and flirt with someone. Why waste time for no reason?" He said this in his usual carefree tone. But from that moment on, Anthony felt uneasy. Lainey's words seemed to carry an unclear threat. But could Anthony seriously think that his friend would try to take his wife away? That was absurd. Christy, his friend, approached the table where Anthony was sitting and began to congratulate him. "Well, I'm very happy for you," she said. "I hope that your married life with Jessica will be prosperous. You're such a beautiful couple." Her congratulations pushed strange thoughts about Lainey out of Anthony's head. On that evening, and for many years afterward, he didn't dwell on it. Anthony's family life seemed to be going well. At least, that was the impression at first glance. At first, his parents helped them with housing, and the young couple rented a small apartment at an affordable price. Some of his father's friends cut him some slack. Then Anthony saved up some money and opened a store. Helen was born. Everything was going well. But Jessica didn't see it that way. Perhaps there wasn't a day in her life when she didn't find something to complain about. "We live in a one-bedroom apartment with a little child," she grumbled. "And soon Helen will grow up, start walking, she'll need space." "Well, she hasn't grown up yet," Anthony replied. "And then we'll see. Maybe we'll take out a mortgage or rent another apartment. With your store, we won't get rich," Jessica sighed in response. "We can't even go on a proper vacation. What's the point of a new apartment? We went to the seaside last year," Anthony exclaimed. "Isn't that enough? Where else did you want to go?" Jessica mumbled something to herself and looked away. Sometimes Anthony couldn't understand what was going on in his wife's head. She behaved oddly, and with each passing year, it seemed to intensify. After giving birth, Jessica became even more prone to tears. Anthony had almost forgotten about it. But seeing tears in Margot's eyes, so similar to those of his ex-wife, brought it all back. Watching Margot cry was almost more painful than watching Jessica. perhaps because her tears seemed more genuine, and the reason for them was much more serious than a failed vacation or old dresses. "Thank you for giving me a ride," Margot said, getting out of the car. "And for standing up for me at the cafe." "No problem," nodded Helen. "And don't cry, please. A smile suits you much better. Would you like me to walk you to your apartment?" Anthony asked. The woman shook her head. "No, thank you. I think everything will be okay. Mike doesn't know my address." "He shouldn't. I've only been renting this apartment for a month." "Thank you, Helen, for the drawing. It's very cute. I'll hang it above my bed to lift my spirits on gloomy days." "It's not mine. It's Dad's drawing," the girl replied. Margot finally smiled. "Of course, Dad's. I completely forgot." "Well, then, thank you too, Dad, for trying so hard for me, for spending time." Anthony felt awkward, mumbled something incoherent, then asked, "Which of these windows is yours?" "Those over there, on the 4th floor," the woman responded. "2 windows with white curtains." "Why? We'll wait until the lights come on there, and then we'll leave," Anthony said. "That way, we'll know for sure that you're okay." "Should I put a flower pot on the window, like in spy movies?" Margot smirked. "Okay, if you're so insistent. I'll try to hurry up so as not to keep you waiting." Margot waved at them and headed towards the entrance. Anthony and Helen watched her until the door closed behind her. After a couple of minutes, the lights came on behind the white curtains. Margot approached the window and waved again. Then she blew Anthony and Helen an imaginary kiss. The girl waved in response, then whispered, "Did you see, Dad? She liked us." "I saw," Anthony muttered. He hesitated to wave back at Margot. "Do you like her, Helen?" she asked. Anthony preferred not to answer that question. He couldn't figure out his own feelings. He was completely tangled up. The entire way home, Helen was in a strange excitement, bouncing in her seat and saying whatever came to her mind. "Great that we went to the cafe today. Who would have protected Margot if we weren't there? You were such a cool dad, like Batman or Spider-Man. I don't know who's cooler. Margot definitely fell for you. Did you see that? Too bad we didn't ask for her phone number, but it's okay. You can find her on the internet." "Please be quiet," Anthony requested. "I have a headache from such an eventful evening." "It's from love," his daughter said. Anthony looked at her. Helen giggled but thankfully fell silent. It's unclear whether Margot herself, Anthony, or Helen had a proper night's sleep. Everyone replayed the events of the previous day in their minds and speculated about what would happen next. The next day brought either a dark or bright period in Anthony's life, depending on one's perspective. It all started with him slipping on ice as he exited the building. Nancy, who was right behind him, immediately rushed to help. "Get up, Anthony. Where does it hurt? Did you hurt yourself badly?" "I'm fine," Anthony muttered, getting up. Not too bad. At that moment, everything seemed okay to him. Anthony even refrained from scolding the neighbor who also exited the building with him. He was sure that Nancy did it on purpose, distracting him with her chatter, and he didn't notice the icy patch behind the wheel. Anthony realized that the situation was much more serious than he initially thought. His right hand wouldn't bend and looked strange overall. The word fracture came to Anthony's mind, someone not versed in medical matters, but he tried to dismiss it. How could there be a fracture when life is filled with so many cares and problems? Work, Helen, and now, Margot added to the list. Nancy, who hadn't left yet, knocked on the car window. Anthony forced himself to smile and rolled down the window. "Is something wrong?" the woman asked anxiously. "Why aren't you driving?" "I think I forgot some documents," Anthony said. "I'll have to go back home right now." He reached for the folder of papers, intending to confirm what he said, but his injured hand wouldn't allow it. Nancy's frightened gaze stopped at his wrist. Her eyes widened. Anthony tried to conceal the problem from her, but you couldn't hide anything from this woman. Although Nancy wasn't a medical professional, she understood everything. "You have a fracture," she exclaimed. Finally, she diagnosed Anthony with the condition he feared. Probably just a dislocation, he replied. Admitting he was injured was a huge weakness for Anthony. Regardless, you need to go to the emergency room, Nancy remarked. I'll call a taxi. No need, I'll manage on my own, Anthony said. However, his neighbor didn't listen and was already dialing a number, calling a cab to the entrance. Accompanied by her on the way to the hospital, Anthony was not in the best mood. The energetic orthopedic doctor who met him on arrival couldn't improve Anthony's spirits. What do we have here? A fracture? He asked, barely glancing at the patient's hand. Congratulations, young man. You're my third today. Thrilled, Anthony muttered, not caring whether he was the second or third. He just wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. The orthopedic doctor either didn't understand or chose not to comprehend Anthony's sarcasm and simply shrugged. What's there to be thrilled about? He asked. Black ice. Now go for an X-ray. We need to know for sure. You said I have a fracture, Anthony protested. Don't argue with the doctor. He knows better, Nancy said, dragging him toward the door. Let's go. Anthony wasn't sure when his neighbor had excused herself from work, but it seemed like she planned to stick to him like glue. I need to let Helen know I won't be able to pick her up, Anthony said, reaching for his phone. Her classes end at noon today. I was supposed to take her to her club. I'll make the call, said Nancy, attempting to take his phone. Anthony withdrew his hand and coldly said, Sorry, but I can handle this myself. I'm not dead yet, just a broken arm. Yes, of course, sorry, Nancy mumbled. Her face looked apologetic, but it was hard to tell if she was sincere or playing a role. Anthony felt a pang of guilt. I'm sorry, he said. I'm just on edge, you know. I'll go for the X-ray now. Just need to call Helen. However, informing his daughter about the broken arm turned out to be less than ideal. Helen was deeply upset upon learning about the incident. Does your arm hurt a lot, Dad? Did they put it in a cast? Will you have to carry it around on a string like in the movies? They won't cut it off, right? Who, my arm? Anthony was shocked by such an assumption. No, of course not. Where do you get these ideas? I'll come to the hospital, Dad. Which hospital are you in? No need to go anywhere. Stay and study. I called you so you wouldn't wait for me after school and could go home. Now, goodbye. Anthony ended the call and sighed heavily. He couldn't have imagined that this conversation would be so difficult. Raising a child is not easy, Nancy remarked, overhearing their conversation. That's an understatement. Anthony nodded. Nancy sighed. Still, I'd like to have children, she said. Children are the flowers of life. Anthony, would you like another boy? Anthony looked at her as if she were crazy. First, Helen with her amputations. Now the neighbor with kids. What's gotten into all of them? Fortunately, Anthony was called into the doctor's office and spared from having to respond. Then he waited in another line to see the orthopedic specialist, and later they set his bone. After all these sharp sensations, when he emerged from the office, an astonishing sight awaited him. Nancy was not alone. Across the corridor stood Helen and Margot. Nancy glared at them, pursing her lips discontentedly, as if she wanted to banish them from the hospital. Margot paid no attention to her, calmly looking at her phone. Helen, oblivious to any dissatisfaction, rushed towards her father. Is everything okay? She asked anxiously, tugging at her father's healthy arm. What did the doctor say? He said I have to wear this cast for at least a month. Anthony replied, showing her his cast. Looks nice, doesn't it? It must have hurt, said Helen, her nose starting to wrinkle. It seemed the girl was seriously considering crying. Not really, Anthony lied. At that moment, when the doctor was manipulating his arm, it felt like he was in a torture chamber. The so-called anesthesia didn't seem to work at all. But I wouldn't recommend ending up here, so be careful, and don't run around on icy patches. See what it can lead to. Margot dipped her phone into her purse and, ignoring Nancy's displeased look, approached them. How are you? Is everything okay? She asked, scrutinizing Anthony's face. Perhaps she read something he was trying to hide from his daughter, the vivid impressions of the last few minutes. I'll survive, nodded Anthony. For a moment, Margot gently squeezed the fingers of his healthy hand, as if it, too, were broken. Anthony gratefully smiled in return. From somewhere on the side, Nancy's annoyed voice was heard. Anthony should really go home. He's been quite nervous today. Let him rest and calm down. That's exactly why I called a taxi. Margot nodded, undid her. Anthony, Helen, let's go. The car will be here in 2 minutes. She took Anthony's healthy hand, Helen grabbed his jacket, and the whole group headed towards the exit. Furious with the world, Nancy trailed behind them. When they stepped outside, a taxi was already waiting by the entrance. Margot turned around, looked at Nancy, and asked with a smile, "Are we on your way?" Though said politely, Nancy's expression grew even more hostile. "This is our neighbor, Nancy." Anthony introduced her, fearing a scene. "And this is..." He hesitated, unsure of how to introduce Margot. But she spoke up. "The pleasure is mine. I'm Anthony's girlfriend," she said. Anthony had heard this statement for the second time, but now it made a greater impression on him. First, because he couldn't understand why Margot said it like that. Second, he feared Nancy's reaction. The neighbor's face revealed a myriad of feelings and emotions. It seemed like she most wanted to grab Margot by the hair. "Pleasure's mine too," Nancy replied, shaking Margot's hand as if she wanted to break her fingers. "So, do you need a ride? Are you going home too?" Nancy shook her head. "No, thanks. I'm heading to work." "Take care, Anthony. See you again." She turned and walked towards the bus stop. Even her straight back radiated disapproval. Helen muttered, "What a witch. Don't call elders names." Anthony scolded her and looked at Margot. "Why did you introduce yourself like that?" "To get rid of unnecessary company," she replied. "To help you, just like you helped me with Mike yesterday." "What's wrong with that?" "Nothing. But I think I should have said something like that myself." Margot sadly smiled in response. "I think you wouldn't dare. And why force you to lie?" Those words left Anthony with a sense of discomfort. It seemed Margot spoke insincerely, just playing with him. And with everyone else too. Trying to change the subject, he asked, "Helen, weren't you supposed to go home after school? Why did you come?" The girl wasn't at all embarrassed by the question. On the contrary, she looked offended. "Yeah, you end up in the hospital, maybe dying, and I'm supposed to sit at home doing homework. Dad, don't talk nonsense. How did you two even meet? Did Margot have your phone?" "I found her online," explained Helen. "Told her what happened to you. I immediately knew where to go," continued Margot. "There's only one emergency room in our town, so next time you get sick, don't bother telling us what exactly. We'll find you right away." Margot and Helen shook hands with smiles. Anthony just shook his head, wondering how they became such fast friends. "Since Helen didn't go to her theater studio today, and I have a day off, we'll spend the whole day at your place," Margot said. "At whose?" Anthony asked. "At yours, of course. I need to check what you feed the child." This was unexpected development number 2. Anthony still couldn't get used to how quickly they had become close. And here was another piece of news. Margot coming to his place. Not inviting herself, but going on her own, as if she had every right. She even entered the building first, asked Helen which floor, and stepped over the threshold. "Now Nancy won't get close to you," Helen said to her father, looking triumphantly at the neighbor's door. "What's the matter?" Margot asked, taking the key from Anthony. Opening the door himself was difficult for him. "Nothing," Anthony mumbled. "Just ignore it. Helen is just chatting." "Not just chatting," the girl objected. "Margot, you know how she chases after Dad. Doesn't give him any space. Sly fox." Margot looked at Anthony. "I hope I'm not causing any trouble." "No, of course not," he sighed. "Nancy and I are just neighbors. Don't listen to Helen. Once in the apartment, Anthony wanted to head to the kitchen, quickly freshen up before the guest arrived. But Margot blocked his way. "Go rest," she said. "We'll take care of things here." In the end, the two women, big and small, sent him to the couch in the living room and locked themselves in the kitchen, giggling about something. "We're preparing a surprise for you," as Helen put it. Anthony called work and checked on things. Williamson didn't disappoint. He asked not to worry and said everything was going as planned. In Williamson's voice, Anthony heard the notes of authority. It seemed the old man was glad to feel like the boss again, to remember his youth. "But I'll come in tomorrow," Anthony promised. It's not that he was jealous of Williamson or anything like that. It just wasn't right to dump his work on a subordinate day after day. "Don't rush, take your time. Everything will be fine," Williamson reassured them. "It's been 2 years since you took a vacation. Stay home as long as you need, maybe even settle down in your personal life." Anthony began to regret sharing his daughter's quarrels with his colleague. Everyone around him seemed to have conspired to marry him off to someone. But why to someone? Anthony knew perfectly well the name of this woman. He looked at the door behind which the clatter of dishes could be heard and dialed Lainey's phone. Lainey answered almost immediately. "Yeah, something happened." Lainey knew that his friend wouldn't call without a reason, especially in the middle of a work day. "Broke my arm," Anthony replied, deciding to skip any greetings. "Oh, really? Over whom did you trip?" Lainey asked cheerfully. "Over the neighbor," Anthony muttered darkly, recalling the way she looked at him in the hospital. As if he were an unfaithful husband. Or someone even worse. "But it's not what you think. We were leaving the entrance. She started complaining to me about the bills. Showing them. Well, and I stumbled. You should sue the management company," Lainey advised. "But it's not funny at all," Anthony muttered, examining his cast. This white hand irritated him more and more. "And seriously, what did you want from me?" Lainey asked. "I'm neither a doctor nor a lawyer." Anthony himself didn't understand why he called his friend. Probably just out of boredom. He wasn't used to idling around like this, sitting on the couch. "Got it. You need a drink again," Lainey guessed. "Good idea. Meet up tonight." Anthony fell silent. He didn't feel like drinking at all. Helen and Margot were nearby, and that was enough for happiness. But who knows what will happen in the evening when the waitress goes home and Helen goes back to her room. Lainey correctly interpreted his silence and said, "In a word, we'll decide later. And now excuse me, I'm already in a meeting. We'll catch up." "Okay." Anthony sat for a while, staring at the dark screen of his phone, and then headed to the kitchen. The silence weighed on him. "Surprise!" his daughter exclaimed when he approached the table. The table was already set. There were plates of fried potatoes, cucumber salad, and even homemade lemonade. Anthony had no idea what they had used to prepare this dinner. "Anthony, you can't let the apartment go like this," Margot explained, correctly interpreting his gaze, and then unexpectedly laughed. "My mother or mother-in-law could say that. But I'll say only one thing, please join the table." Margot smiled again, but not in the same way as in the cafe, mocking and bold. Here at the table, her smile was warm and somehow homely. Anthony didn't know how to describe it, but just looking at Margot's cheerful face made him feel warm inside. And it wasn't because Margot resembled Jessica. On the contrary, Anthony liked Margot precisely because, despite the external similarity, these two women had nothing else in common. "Margot, was your mom strict?" Helen asked. "Not that strict," the woman replied. "I guess she just didn't care much about me." "And yours?" Anthony froze. What would his daughter say to this? In the past, such questions would bring her to tears. Then the girl started getting defensive whenever someone brought up the topic of her mother. But now, "Probably mine too," Helen said. Anthony felt uneasy hearing those words. He had no idea that his daughter remembered everything. No, not like that. Anthony couldn't imagine that a little child could feel so much. Although, perhaps, Helen understood everything much earlier than him. He had been closing his eyes to his wife's peculiarities until the very end. Anthony recalled an incident that happened many years ago. At that time, Helen was 3 or 4 years old. He couldn't remember exactly. Just like he couldn't recall why he had returned home from work early. According to the standard plot, Anthony was supposed to catch his wife with a lover, but that didn't happen. What did happen was even more dreadful for his paternal heart. Helen was crying so much that her sobbing could be heard throughout the entrance. When Anthony opened the door, she rushed into the hallway. From the girl's disjointed speech, it was impossible to make out anything other than the endless repetition of the word daddy. Anthony looked around and asked, "Where's Mom?" Helen didn't answer anything, and it dawned on Anthony. That was the problem. Jessica wasn't at home. If he were a great detective, he could have figured it out himself. His wife's favorite sandals, which she had been wearing lately, were missing from the shelf. There was no handbag either. And most importantly, Jessica wouldn't calmly listen to her child crying. Or would she? Anthony suddenly realized that he didn't have an answer to that question. After calming his daughter somehow, he led her to the room and, off schedule, gave her a juice box. For some reason, Jessica always considered store-bought juices harmful and strictly fed treats according to the schedule. "Will Mom get mad?" asked Helen. "She won't," Anthony promised. At that moment, he himself felt like tearing and throwing things. However, whom he was angry with, the man couldn't explain no matter how hard he tried. He couldn't reach her. Anything could have happened, but Anthony wasn't destined to know what exactly. Maintaining a calm expression in front of his daughter was a real torment. Anthony fed her porridge, turned on a cartoon, and sat next to Helen, pretending to be watching the adventures of drawn hedgehogs and rabbits. In reality, he was attentively listening to what was happening in the hallway. Nevertheless, Helen apparently sensed something because, without taking her eyes off the TV, she said, "Mom will be home soon." Anthony looked at her. "How do you know?" "She always comes before the sun goes down behind the big tree." Helen pointed her finger at the window. "So, she'll be back soon." Anthony looked at the tree growing near the house opposite. Always. It turns out, for Jessica, such situations were normal. "Why did you cry, then, if you knew Mom would be back soon?" Anthony cautiously asked. Helen looked at him trustingly and whispered, "I was sleeping and fell off the bed." "Did you hurt yourself badly?" Anthony asked. "Where does it hurt?" "Nowhere," the girl replied. "I got scared of the monster that lives under the bed. Mom said I shouldn't step on the floor when she's not home because the monster might grab my leg. And I fell." "He won't grab you," Anthony promised. "I'll take a broom and chase him away today." "Really?" Helen asked excitedly. Anthony nodded. Although anger was boiling inside him more and more, he didn't understand what was happening. Jessica was somewhere, leaving their daughter alone. She scared her with strange monsters. At what point did his wife turn into someone entirely unfamiliar, someone from whom anything could be expected? His daughter was right. The key turned in the lock around 4:30. Jessica, humming something, went into the hallway. Helen immediately forgot about the cartoon and ran to her. "Mom," she shouted, hugging Jessica. Jessica, with a tired expression, tousled her daughter's hair and asked, "Is everything okay? You see, staying home is not scary at all. And I brought you a lollipop, as promised." She noticed her husband in the living room and fell silent. To Anthony's dismay, there was no sign of shame, surprise, or any hint of guilt on his wife's face. She looked slightly annoyed. "What did you bring me?" Anthony asked. "Onions, potatoes, and cabbage," Jessica replied, putting the bags on the table. "My hands almost fell off carrying them. I could have bought them myself," remarked Anthony, sensing reproach in his words. In reality, he was surprised that his wife suddenly showed such eagerness for household chores. Jessica had never stooped to the level of bringing vegetables from the store. Anthony himself didn't allow her to do so. And suddenly, unexpected reproaches, as if he were neglecting family matters. "You're not reliable," Jessica muttered. I asked you the day before yesterday to stop by the grocery store, and did you? No, but our store is not up to it now. I told you about it, didn't I? We ran out of potatoes at home, Jessica said. I told you about it too, or did you forget? She went to the kitchen and began to unpack the groceries. Cartoons started playing on the TV, and Helen rushed there to follow the adventures of the rabbit. Anthony went after his wife. He didn't quite understand what was happening, but he felt that the main problem was not about potatoes. More precisely, not only about potatoes. Jessica put on her favorite blue dress, the one that complemented her eyes, sprayed some perfume, and took out a string of pearls inherited from her grandmother. Even someone as simple as Anthony could tell that all this was too much for a grocery run. Why didn't you answer the calls? He asked. Jessica showed her husband the phone with a lifeless dark screen. It ran out of battery. Why did you leave Helen alone? She was almost in hysterics when I came back. Helen is not a little kid anymore, Jessica said coldly. Besides, I was gone for just a minute. To the nearest store and back. Does it take 2 hours to get to the nearest store? Anthony asked. That's about how much time I spent at home. We have no idea how long you were gone. His wife looked at him coldly. Anthony expected her to shout, but Jessica calmly said, I met Phoebe. Satisfied. Anthony struggled to recall that name. Phoebe used to be Jessica's friend back in their college years. Anthony couldn't stand her. This girl was a gossip. Jessica didn't particularly like her either. She tolerated her at best. It was even stranger that, after all these years, Jessica suddenly wanted to reconnect with her. With Phoebe, every day. He clarified. What do you mean, every day? Jessica asked again. Some emotion flickered in her gaze, but Anthony couldn't determine what exactly. It seemed like fear, but that would be absurd. What could Jessica be afraid of? Helen said you leave and come back around 5:30. When the sun sets behind the big tree, he explained. Jessica's patience finally snapped. She tossed the phone onto the table and turned to him. Helen said, Huh? And did she say anything about the monster living under the bed? Or the witch who looks into windows at night? Or maybe about the kittens living in the invisible box on our balcony? Helen is 4 years old, Anthony. Found someone to believe. Jessica walked past him and disappeared into the bathroom. After a couple of minutes, the sound of water splashing and a crash came from there. Jessica was either planning to take a shower or decided to wreak havoc. Anthony never got the chance to ask her about the monster. Don't know why, for the sake of it, she frightened her daughter, who was growing nervous and could burst into tears over a sad cartoon or a nightmare. Something in Jessica's story didn't add up. But what exactly, he couldn't figure out. As usual, Anthony turned to his friend for advice. And what? Lainey asked after listening to Anthony's story. What don't you like about this? What don't I like? Anthony exclaimed. Everything. You better name one thing in all of this that I should like. My wife goes who knows where, leaves our daughter alone in the apartment, and I'm supposed to be satisfied with something. So, you think your wife is cheating on you? Lainey asked. Anthony fell silent. Such a thought did cross the man's mind, though he tried to push it away with all his might. Jessica is cheating on him. It can't be. And with whom? After Helen's birth, his wife became a homemaker. The girl was often sick, needing care. With Paul, the old accountant from her previous job, she didn't have other male acquaintances. Anthony shook his head. I don't think so. Still, it's very strange. Dressing up like that for a trip to the store. Should have married an old woman who doesn't care about anything, Lainey said. He found a problem where there isn't one. His wife wants to look good, and he doesn't like it. But this time, Lainey, who had always been something like the voice of reason for Anthony, couldn't convince his friend of his rightness. Still, Lainey didn't give up his habits. Years went by, but he kept coming back to Anthony with moralizing. Taught him how to live. Poke his nose where it was necessary and where it wasn't. On the day Anthony broke his arm and stayed at home in the company of Helen and Margot, his friend's visit was particularly ill-timed. Anthony even forgot that he had called Lainey. Everything, except empty talk, escaped his mind. Hearing the doorbell, Helen asked anxiously, "Maybe Nancy came." Margot let her down the stairs. However, Margot herself didn't look calm either. Apparently, the uninvited guests caught her off guard. Anthony slapped his forehead. "It's probably Lainey. I called him, told him about my arm, and now his work day is over, and he's here. Came to visit me." "Lainey," Margot repeated. Anthony nodded. "Yes, my university buddy. Didn't I tell you about him?" "Not once," Margot mumbled. Her expression turned displeased. Where had the recent cheerfulness gone? Now Margot resembled more the person Anthony met at the cafe when he initiated this whole tipping story. She seemed ready for a fight. "And what? Is he a good friend?" Margot asked when Anthony headed toward the door. "Do you still trust him after so many years?" The man, already near the door, turned around and looked at her. "Yes," he said in surprise. "Why shouldn't I trust him?" Margot shrugged. Her expression remained displeased. Helen started whispering something to her, probably about Lainey. For some inexplicable reason, the girl always regarded him with caution. Lainey entered the hallway with beer bottles and loudly asked, "Where's the patient?" "I brought medicine." "Hold on," Anthony whispered, pushing his friend's hand with the bottles aside. "Not now for drinks. I have guests, and besides, I promised Helen I wouldn't drink." "Guests?" Lainey glanced at the shoe rack and whistled, seeing Margot's boots there. "Quite the news. And are there many of them?" "Just one." "Margot." "The same one. The waitress from the cafe, resembling Jessica." Lainey was surprised and went into the room. "I have to take a look at her." Persuasion didn't work on him. Lainey walked into the living room and came face to face with Margot. She stood in her usual spot by the window, arms crossed over her chest, looking at him with such an expression that if Anthony were in his friend's place, he would think 100 times before starting a conversation. "Hi," Lainey said. The smile gradually faded from his face. Apparently, he too felt uneasy. "Hi," Margot nodded. They stared at each other and remained silent. Anthony understood that his friend might be taken aback by the resemblance of this woman to Jessica, but he couldn't grasp Margot's behavior. She looked at Lainey as if he were the bitterest enemy, as if they had met some time before. "I came to visit a friend," Lainey said, inexplicably raising the bottles higher to show them to everyone present. "I have the right." "No one's arguing," replied Margot. Her expression, once angry, turned mocking, as if Lainey's behavior amused her. "So, you guys are best friends, huh? Like brothers?" "Well, yes, of course," Lainey said hesitantly. "And what, any doubts?" Margot didn't grace him with a look, sadly smiled at Anthony, and said, "I guess it's time for me to go. It's already late." "It's not even 7 yet," Helen said disappointedly. Observing these incomprehensible adult conversations full of hints and innuendos, the little girl became completely lost and dejected. "It's okay, little one," Lainey said coldly. "Don't detain the lady. If she says she needs to go, let her go." It seemed that Lainey had fully recovered, as his former audacity returned. "I'll leave without asking anyone," Margot replied, heading toward the door. Anthony watched as she put on her shoes, donned her coat, feeling foolish and insignificant. Everything happened so absurdly and unexpectedly. Anthony had no idea what to do or say to detain Margot, to prevent her from leaving. Moreover, there were too many witnesses around, observing her every move. "We'll see each other again, won't we?" he asked when Margot reached for the doorknob. The woman turned around and shrugged. "Maybe," she said. Margot's gaze became indifferent and distant. She looked at Anthony as if they had become strangers. "I'll write to you," Helen shouted from the room. Margot gave a faint smile, nodded to Helen, and went out the door. Silence reigned in the apartment for a while. No one knew what to say. Then Lainey smirked. Well, what a hard ass you brought. She could bite. Not funny, Helen said. Margot is our friend. You need to learn to choose your friends, my dear, Lainey said. Otherwise, who knows what might happen? Helen looked at him contemptuously, as if there was no point in talking to such an idiot, and went to her room. At the same time, the girl stomped with such disdain, as if she wanted the floor to swallow her. Lainey watched her with his eyes and shook his head. Your women have completely lost their minds. Margot is not my woman, Anthony replied. Now, probably, never will be. They entered the kitchen, and Lainey began to uncork the bottles, talking about his work. It seemed like he was desperately trying to fill the silence with words, no matter what they were, just to avoid the silence. Anthony barely heard what he was saying. All his thoughts were focused on Margot. She looks a lot like Jessica, doesn't she? Anthony unexpectedly asked himself. Lainey stopped talking, looked at him, then shrugged and indifferently said, I wouldn't say it's a spitting image. So what? I keep thinking, how is that possible? Anthony said. It can't be just a coincidence. In my opinion, it can, Lainey retorted. There are many lookalikes in the world. I've told you about it. Nevertheless, Anthony didn't believe it. More accurately, he didn't believe his best friend. The mysterious glances between Lainey and Margot instilled anxiety in his soul. He no longer knew whom or what to believe. You know, I probably won't drink, Anthony said. Lainey looked at him with surprise. Why? My head hurts, Anthony lied. In reality, the frothy drink disgusted him. Or rather, it was Lainey himself who disgusted Anthony. His friend shook his head disapprovingly. So it begins. This woman, what? She managed to build you in just a few days of acquaintance. I just don't feel like it, Anthony said. He felt a strange desire to send his friend down the stairs. Lainey sat with him for a while, continuing his grumbling, and finally left. Anthony closed the door behind him with relief, poured the undrunk beer down the sink, and opened the window. It was wet and cold outside, but Anthony didn't care. Most of all, he wanted to get rid of these two smells, beer and Lainey's cologne. His head was pounding even more because of them. Then the man went to his daughter. Did you write to Margot? He asked. Helen didn't pay attention to him. She didn't even turn away from the computer, where some girls in princess costumes were hopping across the screen. Write to her yourself, she said. All right, I get it. I'm at fault again, right? Anthony said. Can you enlighten me on what exactly? The girl sighed, paused the game, and then turned to her father. Dad, remember you asked me not to hang out with Rory? I remember, nodded Anthony, because that Rory is just dumb. He runs around the yard with a stick, shouting like a lunatic. I'm afraid he might harm you, and I stopped talking to him, right? Helen continued. So why do you keep talking to Lainey? I told you he's brainless. In my opinion, he's even worse than Rory. I don't know. Lainey has a college degree, and your Rory will graduate with a school certificate. Who needs that education anyway? Helen exclaimed angrily. Dad, I'm not talking about that. Lainey drove Margot away from us. That's bad. And his grades, what do we care about them? Anthony had to admit that she was right. With Lainey's arrival, everything had changed, and not for the better. Only he and Margot used to laugh at some joke. And now the woman herself was so distant. The change was drastic, and it was challenging to explain it with something other than Lainey's interference. Write to her yourself, Helen said. I've already done a lot for you. I took Margot to the hospital this morning. Hinted to her to get rid of Nancy because we need her. And also, I got it, Anthony sighed. I'll write. Or better yet, I'll visit her at work tomorrow. Probably too late to write today. Margot is probably already asleep, and she has to get up early tomorrow. But she probably couldn't sleep after the way we treated her, Helen muttered. Anthony himself felt a vague sense of guilt towards Margot. He could have somehow kept her, found out what was wrong. Instead, he succumbed to Lainey's influence. It felt like Laney was indeed his evil genius, giving advice that only made things worse. Anthony didn't sleep well that night either. The cast was bothering him. Someone's alarm, periodically blaring in the yard, was irritating. But most of all, the memories of Margot's sad look when she left bothered him. Anthony felt the need to apologize, although he didn't understand what for. Taking advantage of the freedom granted by Williamson, he went to the cafe early in the morning. "Mind if I join you?" Helen immediately asked. Anthony shook his head. "No need. I'll manage on my own." "You were right. I shouldn't rely on others. It's time to do something myself instead of just waiting for help from others. And you should stop skipping classes. I feel like they'll call me to school soon because of your grades. I don't want to be embarrassed for you." "Who's talking?" the girl said. "I blush for you every day," she smiled. "Good luck." Anthony could indeed use some luck, because as he headed to the cafe, he was nervous, like before a first date. Turning 40 soon, and feeling like a teenager. Anthony scolded himself mentally. Laney was right calling me a dimwit. There couldn't be a more fitting word. However, at the cafe, it turned out he worried for nothing. Margot wasn't at her workplace. "Where is she?" Anthony asked the manager. "Does she have a day off today?" The manager shook her head. "No. Margot was supposed to be on shift today. I don't know what happened. She's not answering calls. I'll go to Margot's home and find out everything," Anthony promised. Only then did he realize if it was worth saying so. The cafe staff didn't know about him and his relationship with Margot. However, the woman smiled. "That would be best. Find out. Margot has had a tough life. It's good that she finally met someone decent." When Anthony left the cafe, it seemed to him that everyone present was watching him. Both the wait staff and the patrons. The manager nearly crossed herself. It seemed she had a warm attitude towards Margot and genuinely cared about her fate. Anthony took a taxi home to Margot because it was difficult for him to drive. But there, too, he faced disappointment. No one answered the door, although he thought he heard some noises in the apartment. Anthony left the entrance and began to look at the windows. Not a single curtain moved. Engrossed in observing the windows, Anthony didn't notice the approaching danger, and when he did, it was too late. "You again?" a grim voice behind him asked. "Stalking my wife, you freak." Anthony turned around and saw Margot's husband, Mike, the same one who had been eyeing her at the cafe. He was drunk again and swaying slightly. However, the man's eyes looked perfectly conscious and malicious. Anthony foresaw what would follow, but he couldn't help but say it. "Ex-wife," he said. Mike punched him. Anthony had no chance to defend himself or retaliate. The broken right arm became a hindrance, and fighting on the icy asphalt was challenging. Together with Mike, they fell on the ice and started beating each other. Anthony tried to manage with his left hand, but it was difficult. The opponent was much stronger, and they belonged to different weight categories. At some point, Mike started to choke him, and that was the last thing Anthony remembered. Before blacking out, he somehow regretted not apologizing to Margot, as if it were the most important thing. Perhaps, when you're dying, you should ask forgiveness from everyone, so they remember you kindly. Anthony woke up in the hospital. He deduced that it was indeed a hospital, not something else, from the smell of medicine. And those white walls could only be in one place. The stern-looking doctor who gazed at him confirmed Anthony's suspicion. "Congratulations, young man," he said. "You've got a fracture from the fight." The doctor's words reached Anthony's consciousness with great difficulty. He tried to look at his hand and assess the damage, but he couldn't. His neck was stiff and numb. Everything else in his body hurt simultaneously and felt foreign. Anthony felt like he had turned into one big bruise. "What's wrong with my hand?" Anthony asked, despairing of seeing anything among the sheets. "There's a bone displacement," the doctor pronounced. "We'll perform surgery tomorrow." "Why tomorrow?" Anthony inquired. "Because today was eventful enough for you," the doctor replied. didn't have your fill of sharp sensations for one day. Seriously, I won't take on your case. Dr. Barr will take over and operate on you. It's too much for me." From his words, Anthony understood that he should brace himself for the worst. Helen's worries about them amputating his arm weren't unfounded. Speaking of Helen, what time is it? Anthony asked, futilely trying to spot a clock in the ward. 7:30, the doctor said, specifying, in the evening, if that matters to you. Of course, it matters, Anthony replied. He was ready to scream from such tranquility. My daughter is alone at home. She's probably beside herself, wondering where I disappeared. Anthony said, your daughter is here, in the corridor, waiting for you to wake up for 2 hours already, the doctor replied. Here? Anthony asked incredulously. She came alone. Who told her where I am? I have no idea. Some woman brought her. I didn't ask for any ID, the doctor said. As he said these words, the doctor looked slightly irritated. Well, at least some display of emotion. Otherwise, Anthony was starting to feel like he was dealing with a robot. Dad. Helen rushed into the room and froze in horror at the sight of her father. Anthony recalled the last moments etched in his memory, the contorted face of Mike, his feeble attempts at defense, and realized he didn't look his best. Helen had always been afraid of horror movies, and now he resembled a character from one, he thought. Scared? Anthony asked, attempting to put on a smile. It was challenging. His face hurt too. Nothing. I just look terrible, and actually, it's not as bad as it seems, he reassured. Apparently, Helen didn't believe him, as she began to cry. Quietly, soundlessly, and it broke Anthony's heart. Who did you come with? He asked, trying to steer the conversation anywhere to make his daughter stop crying. Who told you what happened? I did, Margot whispered softly as she entered the room. Her demeanor was timid and indecisive, unlike anything Anthony had seen before. It seemed Margot had been crying too. The bruises under her eyes spoke of that. Perhaps, like Anthony himself, she had spent the previous night without sleep. Anthony extended his uninjured hand to her, and who knows how much effort it took him to do that. But Margot shook her head and said, forgive me. For what? Anthony asked in confusion. Because of me, you suffered, Margot replied. All of this happened to you because of me. Actually, it wasn't you who beat me up. Mike did. Anthony tried to make a joke, but it didn't work. Tears welled up in Margot's eyes, just like in Helen's. Finally, she sat on a chair next to Anthony's bed and took his hand. Helen left the room. Early this morning, I was at home, but I didn't open the door for you, Margot whispered. If only I had acted differently, none of this would have happened. You suffered because of my cowardice. But what were you afraid of? Anthony wondered. And why did you run away yesterday when you saw Lainey? I don't understand anything. No wonder, said Margot, wiping her eyes. You've been deceived for so many years. They filled your head with lies. Probably, Anthony's face showed that he still didn't understand anything. Margot continued. I was afraid Lainey would say nasty things about me. He's a good liar. Over the years, I've become convinced of that. Besides, Lainey is your friend. Whom were you supposed to believe, him or me? You've known me for such a short time. Of course, you, exclaimed Anthony, then immediately looked embarrassed. A couple of days ago, I probably would have answered differently, but now, I think I've figured something out or just started to understand. I'm not sure. Lainey has seemed shady to me lately, as if I didn't know him before. Wait, did you say you've known him for many years? Margot nodded. Yes, and I'll tell you more. I'm Jessica's sister. Her twin, she added, looking at Anthony's astonished face. It was a big revelation. Anthony looked at her and couldn't find words, while Margot continued. Jessica never told you about my existence. Of course, because then her secret would be revealed, Margot whispered. What secret? Mumbled Anthony, unsure if he wanted to know more. Are there really any other secrets besides this one? You have no idea how many, replied Margot. What would you say if you found out that on our first date, it wasn't Jessica but me? This news indeed had a much stronger impact on Anthony than the previous revelation. If Margot's relationship with Jessica didn't shock him too much, something like this was suspected deep down. However, the story about their first date was a shock. "So, it was you and me?" Anthony mumbled and couldn't finish the sentence. Margot nodded. "Yes. You were climbing into someone else's window to save a cat, and I kissed you." "Really? So many years have passed, and I still feel embarrassed when I think about it. What's wrong with me?" Anthony wondered. "More like what's wrong with me," said Anthony. "How could I live for so many years thinking that you were her? I mean, the other way around." I got confused. Anthony avoided calling his wife by name. Even without that, he felt like the ghost of Jessica was standing right there in the room, listening to every word. "You didn't even know I existed in the world," Margot said. "But I should have." Anthony replied bitterly, recalling his married life with Jessica. Falling in love with one girl and marrying another, what could be more absurd? Now he understood why Jessica was so irritated by any mention of their first date. Rescuing a kitten, the so-called heroic act. "It's all nonsense," she used to say. "Found something to remember," Anthony recalled with bitterness. Jessica was uncomfortable with discussions about it because Anthony remembered not her but another. She was jealous of her husband towards her own sister. Why did she do it? Anthony asked, looking at Margot. She correctly understood his gaze. "You want to ask why we did it? Why Jessica asked me to take her place, and why I agreed?" Anthony nodded. "It's simple. Jessica was ambitious but a coward. She dreamed of getting a good husband but was afraid of guys as if they were a plague. They never chased after her. On the contrary, they didn't notice her at all. It's a bit strange. After all, we were so similar." "Are you saying that guys lined up for you?" Anthony asked, experiencing unexpected jealousy towards those youngsters from the past. "That was a long time ago, and it's not true," Margot smiled. "So, you have nothing to worry about." "Not so untrue," Anthony remarked. "Today, I was almost trampled in a similar line." Margot instantly became serious. "The police have already detained Mike. He won't come anywhere near you. You'll see." "Till you neither," Anthony assured her. "Once they fix my hand, you won't have to hide and run away from anyone. I promise." Margot gratefully shook his hand and continued. In a word, Jessica entered college without any desire of her own. She yielded to our mother. She dreamed of seeing Jessica married to someone intelligent. It didn't work out with me. I wasn't particularly eager to get married. I value my freedom. I had no desire to sit at a desk for an extra 5 years. I got a job as a receptionist at a beauty salon, then as a secretary. But Jessica could be turned into anyone. Mother said she'd get married, so it would be. And it's not your fault that you turned out to be the suitable candidate. But I made a mistake. Agreed to this adventure of substitution. Jessica wanted to make you fall in love. But at the last moment, she got scared. Scared of what? Anthony wondered. Well, how? What if you turn out to be a crazy maniac and attack her in the middle of the street? Margot smirked. I told you. She had no experience at all. And I unexpectedly became interested in who noticed my sister. I offered her my help, wanted to discreetly take a look at you undercover. I felt that day that it wasn't Jessica with me, Anthony said. Even your energies are different. You're bright, unique, and she. Anthony couldn't find the words. Jessica was like everyone else, Margot said. It would be nice to say that about your sister, especially a deceased one. She married you on herself and was happy. And you didn't care. Anthony asked. We met once, and you forgot. Apparently, Margot noticed the hurt in his voice because her face again took on a guilty expression. No, of course not, she said. But I was just a girl. Foolish. I gave my sister my word that you wouldn't find out about me. And I kept it. Jessica was ashamed to reveal the truth about the first date. and I had just left for the capital for a few years. I thought, okay, we'll never see each other again. But on the day you got married, I got drunk for the first time in my life. I realized I made a mistake, but it was too late to change anything. I made a mistake when I married her, Anthony muttered. Did you live together so badly? Margot asked. More like not bad at all, but not good either. A year or two after the wedding, I realized that Jessica and I had nothing in common. I would even say it was all in vain. Anthony paused for a moment and added, and Jessica cheated on me. I found out about it completely by accident. Because of that, Jessica died. Anthony found it quite challenging to recall that day, but it remained etched in his memory down to the smallest details. Things in their family were getting worse and worse. Jessica's endless departures from their home frustrated him, and his wife remained indifferent to all his inquiries. You have a vivid imagination, she would say. I just went to a class reunion. Is that not allowed? Or she would come up with something else. I've been shopping for a long time, alone with a child in four walls. I'll start howling soon, like an animal. Even though her lies were obvious, Anthony didn't know what to pick at. More precisely, he didn't know how to pick at it. Jessica would look at him with a calm, expressionless gaze and respond with nonsense. Naively, Anthony believed that something could still be fixed. He blamed himself, thinking that he spent too little time with the family. Perhaps, if they went somewhere together, he could mend these relationships. At least not for himself, but for his daughter. A countryside resort. Jessica asked when Anthony shared his idea. Why would we do that? You yourself said that we're rarely together. And Helen must be bored sitting in the city all the time. In the summer, she's always indoors. So, I chose a place where it would be interesting for the child. Look, there's a river, playgrounds. I get it, Jessica said. You don't need to recite the entire promotional brochure to me. She didn't look pleased. Quite the opposite. Don't you want to go? Anthony asked. Jessica didn't have time to answer. Helen chose that moment to come into the kitchen and ask, where are we going? Far, out of town. Anthony smiled. There's a big green forest, like in fairy tales, a river, and I think there are even some animals. Chickens or ostriches, not sure. Let's go. Helen exclaimed excitedly. We are going, Mom, right? Chickens, ostriches. Dreamed about it all my life, Jessica muttered, but, meeting her daughter's pleading gaze, waved her hand. Get ready, if you want to. We'll go. They did go out of town. But Anthony couldn't shake the feeling that everything was going awry. Jessica seemed to be with him, but Anthony felt it was just an illusion. In her thoughts, his wife was somewhere far away, sometimes staring thoughtfully out the window at the passing fields and villages, sometimes texting someone on her phone. Who are you texting all the time? Anthony asked. Didn't we leave the city to forget about civilization? Yes, for that, Jessica mumbled, still looking out the window. It seemed she hadn't even heard what her husband said. Anthony hoped that at least in nature, his wife would unwind and let go of her quirks. But that didn't happen. Jessica felt unwell, and after a half-hour walk by the river, she decided to go back to the room. Helen was instantly disappointed. Mom, we haven't seen the ostriches yet. I have a headache, Helen. Watch them with Dad. She went back to the hotel, and Anthony glanced at his daughter. Again, we're left alone, right? Lately, this had been happening more and more often, just like Jessica's departures. They had visited a small zoo area. There were no ostriches here, only chickens and a dozing goat in the corner. But for Helen, it was enough to experience boundless excitement. Anthony, on the other hand, was here and seemingly not here. He answered his daughter's questions absent-mindedly and continued to ponder how Jessica was doing. Was she really feeling unwell? Or was she just pretending? He irresistibly felt drawn to the room to find out the truth. Can you stay here alone for about 10 minutes? He asked his daughter. I'll go check how Mom is feeling. I'll go with you, Helen immediately responded. No need, I won't be long. and Mom is probably sleeping. And the goat just woke up. Anthony spun any excuse that came to mind just to keep Helen in place, to prevent her from coming with him and witnessing an important conversation. The argument about the goat worked. Helen was indeed a typical city child, looking at rural animals as if they were some kind of wonder. "Okay, just be quick," she said, leaning against the fence, behind which the goat was munching on hay. Anthony went upstairs and hesitated at the door. To enter or not? What if Jessica was really feeling unwell, and he would disturb her by entering? Silence filled the room, and Anthony considered turning around to leave. However, unexpectedly, Jessica's laughter echoed from inside. "Bully, it's just hilarious. This fool brought us to some wilderness. Unbearably boring." Anthony froze at the door. The conversation was about him. There was no doubt about that. But with who was Jessica talking? With her friend or? "No, sweetheart. Of course, we'll meet on Monday. Do you really think I'll sit in this wilderness for a week?" Now Anthony was sure that his wife was cheating on him. And it didn't even matter with whom. The name of the rival didn't matter at that moment. The confirmation of his long-standing fears was a blow to Anthony. He walked as if in a daze, not knowing where he was going. Jessica's mocking laughter still echoed in Anthony's ears. He descended to the first floor, walked past the slightly open door that led to the bar, then returned. Anthony couldn't fathom how long he sat there and how much he drank. Perhaps not too much, since he didn't black out and understood what was happening around him. At least, Jessica came into the bar with a face twisted in disgust. He saw quite clearly. "Alcoholic," she angrily exclaimed. "So, this is where you are. Left the child outside and sit here, huh, child?" It took a moment for Anthony to realize that she was talking about their daughter. "What about Helen?" "She's fine." Helen returned to the room on her own. "But you, I don't want to see you." Jessica proudly raised her head and walked toward the exit of the bar. Swaying, Anthony followed. "We need to talk." "We'll talk at home," Jessica said. Home. This thought seemed tempting. Anthony couldn't wait to get back to the city and confront the scumbag trying to take his wife away. "Then let's go right now," he said. Jessica looked at him mockingly. "You mean you're capable of driving?" Anthony nodded. He'd even go on foot. He couldn't wait to punch that guy in the face. And now, after many years, he once again berated himself for his foolishness. "We had an accident at the 91st kilometer," Anthony told Margot. "It was dark. I thought some animal, maybe a deer or a moose, ran onto the road. I lost control, and the car swerved off onto the shoulder. I was barely hurt, Helen neither, but Jessica. She died right there on the road, without regaining consciousness." "You shouldn't blame yourself for this," Margot said. "Not blame myself for driving drunk," Anthony wondered. "But I knew perfectly well how it could end. I knew, and yet I went to the city. We're all guilty of what happened," Margot said thoughtfully. "You wanted to arrange a celebration for the whole family, but Jessica didn't want that. She was cheating on you. That's what made you explode. And I, out of stupidity, agreed to play along with my sister and went on a date with you. If we hadn't met that day, maybe you wouldn't have married Jessica." "Probably," Anthony agreed. "In reality, I was hoping Jessica would change. Hoping that the girl I fell in love with many years ago would be back by my side. And is she back now? Isn't she?" Margot smiled. Anthony gratefully squeezed her hand and then sighed. "Helen doesn't remember the accident. She completely forgot that day. I don't know how to tell her what happened. We'll tell her together. From the very beginning," Margot promised. Then she sighed and added, "I know who Jessica's lover was." Anthony looked at her, stunned, hesitating to ask for clarification. At that moment, he felt too tired and wasn't sure if he really wanted to know the truth. "It was Lainey," Margot said. Seeing Anthony's surprise, she added, "Yes, exactly him. The man pretending to be your friend." Anthony wanted to object, to say that it must be some mistake, that it simply couldn't be true. However, every objection he came up with immediately crumbled in the face of the facts. Anthony recalled the way his friend looked at Jessica during the wedding banquet. The conversations that occasionally arose during their married life when Jessica would mention how successful Lenny was while Anthony was stagnating in his shop. The smirks from his friend. Perhaps Margot interpreted his silence as a sign of distrust because she said, "I saw them myself, Jessica and Lenny, in a cafe, when I went there with a friend. I tried to talk to my sister, but she said it was none of my business. That Lenny is rich and promising, and you, a pathetic loser," Anthony said. "I know, Jessica often called me that. You're not such a loser. After all, I noticed you," Margot joked. "Isn't that enough? Even too much for me," Anthony agreed. "You know, when you mentioned Lenny's name, I immediately thought I wanted to recover as quickly as possible. Heal the stupid arm and break something of Lenny's. But now I think, forget it. Yes, he stole Jessica. But now I have you." They sat like that for a long time, seeming like an entire eternity. Later, Helen joined them. She silently entered the room and sat on the edge of the bed. Anthony knew he had a lot of challenges ahead: surgery, a serious conversation with his former friend, explanations to his daughter. None of it scared him anymore. As long as Margot and Helen were by his side, he could endure everything. Together,